We're living our truth now. Krista, what?
Krista who?
Christadelphian?
Did you say Christian Dolphin? So are you from Philadelphia?
Welcome to the Life After Leaving podcast, an ex-Christadelphian podcast.
Hello, heathens, and welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Zinnia. Today I'm going to take you all the way back to the 1840s, when a new religion that challenged the dominant religions of the day emerged and spread rapidly across the United States. This new belief system quickly gained attention in the coming decades as people grappled with what happens after death in the wake of mass deaths such as the American Civil War in the 1860s. This new religion even spread to Europe, and within a few decades, it is estimated that millions of people had converted to the new religion. And no, I'm not talking about the Christadelphians just yet. However, this other new religion started on equal footing as the Christadelphians. This other group also has humble roots in America, and it was said to actually be founded the same year as the Christadelphians, competing for the same audiences and for subscribers to their publications. However, this competitor rapidly jumped onto the national stage and pushed people away from established religions and towards spirituality. Estimates vary on its popularity, but some say that 10% of the American adult population believed in it in the 1850s, and some estimate that by 1863, there were about 7 million people belonging to this religion, while membership for Christadelphians has never been recorded as having reached more than 75,000 members worldwide. While the success of this other religion has dwindled over the past few generations, it still remains alive and a thorn in the side of the Christadelphians into the modern day. So today, please join me as we dive into this centuries-old feud between Christadelphians and spiritualism. We're going to talk about seances, hypnotism, and ghosts. You may not have heard about spiritualism before. I mean, I certainly don't remember anyone mentioning it from the platform when I was a member personally, but I'm happy to tell you all the most fascinating facts about it, as well as the history of the feud between them and the Christadelphians, which goes back to the beginning of both movements. Although, to be honest, this feud appears to mostly be Christadelphians simply having an obsession with the Spiritualists, which only comes second to their obsession with Catholicism. The Spiritualists did clap back once, and it is one of my favorite historic facts that I've discovered while working on this podcast, but you'll have to wait until the end of this episode for that. Now, I learned about spiritualism right before I started my research into Christadelphian history, actually. So I was surprised when this religion came up in John Thomas's biography of all places. It was only a short line about how a Campbellite named Dr. Richardson, who John Thomas had once associated with, had apparently left the group and became a spiritualist. This was just one of those little reminders to me that history doesn't happen in a vacuum, and it reminded me that while John Thomas was delving into religion in America, he was simultaneously living through the rise of spiritualism, which was a threat to someone who was trying to convince followers of his beliefs. Since I was already interested in spiritualism, I decided to look into whether Christadelphians had written anything else about spiritualists, and I discovered that spiritualism was mentioned in Christadelphian writings at least a dozen times between 1852 all the way to 2004. Clearly, the spiritualists had gotten under the Christadelphian skin to justify the attention the Christadelphians were giving them for over a century in their publications, and the effort that Christadelphians were exerting to convince their members not to believe in spiritualism and to avoid losing any followers to this unusual belief system. So to get us started, let me say that spiritualism itself is a wild ride that I can't wait to tell you about. Its core belief is that there is life after death, and therefore in the existence of spirits, which are believed to be able to communicate with the living. So basically, if you believe in ghosts or believe that your loved ones are watching over you after they've passed away, then you might already hold some spiritualist beliefs. You may also already be familiar with some famous spiritualists, such as Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Mary Lincoln Todd, Thomas Edison, Mae West, Queen Victoria, and the first woman to run for president in the United States, Miss Victoria Woodhull, who ran for president in 1872. Yes, they were all spiritualists, and they believed in the existence of spirits. Also, while spiritualism itself has declined in numbers over time, the belief in life after death remains very high. I want to add a quick statistics break here. Statistics break, woo! Because if you were raised Christadelphian, this probably feels almost common sense or scientific to believe that there is nothing after death. I get it. It's a belief that's easy to keep after leaving the group, and I did continue to believe that myself for a long time. And if you want to know why I changed my mind on that topic, you can listen to my interview episode on this podcast for more on that specifically. However, belief in nothingness after death is actually the minority view, at least in the United States. According to 2023 Pew Research data, in the United States, 71% of the population reported believing in heaven, and more than half believe that people who have died are united with loved ones after death. There's more. An estimated 83% of Americans believe that people have a soul or a spirit separate from their physical body. 83%! To continue talking about spirits, an estimated 65% of Americans believe that spirits or unseen spiritual forces exist, and 81% of Americans say that there is something spiritual beyond the natural world, even if we can't see it. About 40% also say that they have had a strong feeling that someone who passed away was trying to communicate with them, and a 2024 article found in their survey that 61.4% of Americans in their sample believe in ghosts. So basically a spirit of a human who has died and continues to exist in a spiritual form after death. So if these statistics are accurate, most people actually believe that there is some sort of soul or spirit inside of us that continues to exist after death, and many believe in ghosts or in the idea that loved ones still exist somewhere and may even be watching over them. But these ideas, of course, would never be embraced by Christadelphians. Their opposition to that idea is actually one of the core beliefs of Christadelphians. Therefore, the main reason that Christadelphians were so opposed to spiritualists throughout history is that that belief in life after death contradicts one of their main beliefs. If you review the Birmingham Amended Statement of Faith, or BASF, which is the document that outlines the beliefs of the Christadelphians that I was formerly associated with, there is a section called Doctrines to be Rejected. Article 8 of those doctrines to be rejected is, quote, that man consciously exists in death, unquote. So essentially, the Christadelphians believe that there is no one who exists in any way with consciousness after death. Essentially, if you want to be a Christadelphian, you have to believe that ghosts and spirits do not exist. The funny thing which makes this kind of a bold belief to have is that there are a lot of examples of people existing in a conscious form after death in the Bible. Like, you've got Jesus, who didn't stay dead, first off, but he's special, son of God, whatever. And so, supposedly he was human after being dead, so maybe not even technically a spirit. So we'll kind of skip him as much as we can for this episode. But we are going to talk a little bit about the Bible because there's also the prophet Samuel, who came back as a spirit in an encounter referred to by the woman involved, who is called the Witch of Endor, which is going to come up in this episode. But there are a few other spirits who are reportedly seen in the Bible that we'll talk about as well. So I guess more specifically, Christadelphians don't believe that anyone except God's favorite humans exist in a conscious form after death. And I guess anyone else isn't God's favorite and doesn't get to pass go and collect immortality early. So we'll discuss those who Christadelphians have speculated may already be immortal too. So for those listeners who aren't former Christadelphians, let me go through what the Christadelphians generally teach in a little more detail regarding what a Christadelphian should expect when they die. So when you die as a Christadelphian, they say that your physical body decomposes and you stop existing in every imaginable way. There's no afterlife, no heaven, no hell, no immediate judgment, no recollection of your life flashing before your eyes, and no watching over your descendants or haunting your enemies. Which, bummer, because I've got a list of people to haunt when I go. Watch out. Moving on, their doctrine teaches that once you're dead, you're essentially asleep forever and you just become dust again until you're resurrected to receive immortality. Immortality is really their long-term goal, and by long-term, I mean they will waste their entire mortal life waiting to get an immortal life. Sometimes I think that this is the entire reason why John Thomas made this religion, is because he didn't want to die, and he wanted the key to eternity and believed that this was it. Christadelphians today believe that God has punished humans with mortality because they have something that doesn't exist in any tangible way that can be measured called sin. You've probably heard of sin, but having sin basically means a person did something bad that God apparently doesn't like and doesn't approve of while they were alive, even though God made them with this ability to commit sin. What's interesting more broadly is that it's church leaders who say what God thinks is a sin, which is interesting because it changes and varies so much between religions. I did a quick Google search for what would be a sin for Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, and the Exclusive Brethren. And historically, some things that these different religions thought were sins could include using birth control and drinking coffee, smoking cigarettes and getting blood transfusions, eating with people outside of church members, reading fiction books, and women cutting their hair. So according to at least 4 religions, I'm a sinner. And of course, as we've heard in other episodes, many ecclesias will disfellowship people if they vote in public elections or remarry. So I guess these would kind of fall under this idea of sin in the Christadelphian community as well. So once you're dead, your dusty ass has 2 paths open for you. And forgive me if this isn't perfect, but Christadelphian teachings as I learned them in the group that followed the BASF document goes something like this. Anyone who is a baptized Christadelphian, and that distinction is important, while they were alive, will be resurrected. So basically made human again like they were before they died, and then transferred to Israel, specifically Jerusalem, I think. And I just assumed this was by teleportation because the specifics of travel methods weren't specified. Once they're there, they'll live there for 1,000 years, while Jesus basically interrupts global politics. The world becomes more chaotic to get ready for God returning to Earth after that 1,000 years ends. Once God and Jesus are both on Earth with the immortal humans, then the world on Earth is now God's kingdom, and no one is mortal anymore. Any of the bad humans were murdered by this point, and all the good ones, who may or may not have been the murderers in that scenario, are now immortal. Christadelphians are taught that their overriding desire for life now should be the best Christadelphian they can be so that they can be in the kingdom with God. We'll discuss the kingdom more in another episode at some point, but for now, it's just important to know that the kingdom of God is the reward that the whole religion hinges on, and basically it's the carrot at the end of the stick, motivating their faith and devotion to the group. You're supposed to spend your whole life thinking about this place and trying to learn enough and show up to meeting enough that God will let you be in it with him. It is a very exclusive club, tough bouncers, VIP only. However, that's only for baptized Christadelphians. So for anyone who wasn't a baptized Christadelphian, either because they chose not to get baptized or because they never learned Christadelphian teachings at all, which most people on the planet will never learn, they will basically just stay dead because God, thinks they suck apparently. No resurrection for you. This is also why the group promotes baptism so hard, because according to the BASF, baptism is necessary for salvation, and a knowledge of Christadelphian teachings is necessary to make that baptism valid. So basically, your baptism doesn't count if a non-Christadelphian baptized you, or you hadn't attended Christadelphian classes, or hadn't passed the baptismal exam. Even worse, that means you might have to pass a pop quiz on theology to be saved by God. Can you imagine being dead for 100 years and you get resurrected and an angel with a clipboard being like, I have to check if your baptism is valid. Can you please explain God manifestation to me? You have 60 seconds. If you're incorrect, you will be killed a second time. I would fail, and then he would kill me again. He'd be like, sorry, you didn't pass the quiz, so you can't sing hymns to God in Jerusalem for the rest of eternity. And I would miss out on that chance at eternal choir practice or whatever they do in Jerusalem for eternity. So for most people, they would fall into one of those categories where you're either resurrected and saved, or you're dead forever because you weren't a baptized Christadelphian. And yes, even if you've never heard of the Christadelphians, or if you're a literal child in an ecclesia who's scared of going underwater and hasn't been baptized yet, you can't be saved according to that version of Christadelphia. And that's why so many Christadelphians get baptized young, because why wouldn't you want to be saved when the alternative is kind of terrifying? Some other branches of Christadelphia and individuals in the Christadelphians may hold different beliefs around this subject, but this is the historical take, and the one that Dr. Thomas originally developed, since he insisted that knowledge and baptism were required, and he did not provide, more details, exceptions on children, the disabled, anything like that. However, there's also a third option. Again, if I'm remembering correctly, this is for the naughty people, where God resurrects you, then tells you to your face, basically, that he thinks you suck and then kills you again. So this is why I kind of feel like this God in this religion is kind of petty, because that sounds like something a Greek god would do. oh, you didn't want to take a theology exam? Well, now I'm going to bring you back to life for a few minutes so that you can gnash your teeth because I have nothing better to do. And then you're not going to exist again and have no recollection that this interaction ever happened because you're not conscious in that death and there's no hell. So there's like no point to resurrecting people, just to torment them and kill them again. So the God they describe is not the most loving version out there, if I'm remembering this correctly. And if you're wondering which group I would be considered to be in, it would be this one because I was baptized. So that therefore would mean I was accountable, had knowledge, and had a baptism. But now I'm naughty, as the Aussies would say, because I no longer believe and practice Christadelphian beliefs. So I have that to look forward to if they're right, which means I actually personally have something on the line here if I'm wrong and they're correct in their theology. If you're an ex-Christadelphian, you may be in that category too. But honestly, I just don't really see the point of God resurrecting people to tell them they're not good enough, except to be really petty. Like, don't you have a kingdom to establish over the entire earth? I thought you loved everyone and created them in your image. Why are you wasting time resurrecting people just to torment them? That's just pretty twisted. Weren't the rainbows because you weren't going to do a mass extinction of humans ever again? Like, I'm pretty sure the kingdom plan involves a mass extinction event for almost everyone, if the only people you're sparing are pretty much the Christadelphians and like maybe the old prophets or something. So, anyways, in general, Christadelphians are taught to expect that after they die, they will get their bodies back, pack up their bags, move to Israel, and live as immortals after basically waking up from a dreamless sleep. Their pores will look amazing and they'll feel so great and ready to worship. And you'd better be a good Christadelphian, or else God will resurrect you just to watch you grind your teeth and die, like I said before, which is just, again, so dark, honestly. So maybe it's understandable that many people were drawn to the more democratic, optimistic, and loving views presented by spiritualism. These millions of people who held spiritualist beliefs believed that when people died, they still exist in some conscious form in death, which they termed being in spirit, and that those spirits have consciousness and can often make contact with the living with the assistance of a medium. There's no vengeance, no judgment, no gatekeeping, no need for eternal worship, no pettiness, no gnashing of teeth, and no favoritism either with the spiritualist beliefs. Everyone is equal here. There's no exclusive knowledge required, no personal sacrifices need to be made while you're alive. You don't have to abandon your unbaptized children when an angel comes to take you to another country out of nowhere. And there's no punishment either for not believing in it or for not getting baptized. And if you're paying attention, this is an example of Christadelphian beliefs teaching that they have exclusive knowledge that you need in order to get a reward that only they have, which is a really common attribute of cults. So, good thing they're not a cult, because that would be really awkward. So please just keep the difference in beliefs regarding life after death in mind throughout this episode, because that's really the foundation for the religious views of these two groups that's relevant for this episode. Got it? Okay, now let's get into the fun history. Dr. John Thomas recognized that both of these religions could not be true at the same time, because the beliefs in what happens after death are truly polar opposites. This was expressed in the following quote, which he published in the July 1852 edition of his Herald of the Kingdom and Age to Come magazine. Thomas wrote that, quote, "It is doubtless true that if the spirit mongers' claims be proved to be God's truth, the system we advocate will be exploded. No doubt of it. It ought to be. For if their claims be true, the system we exhibit must be false, utterly and entirely false. There is no agreement between spirit worldism and the Bible, so that if mesmerized theology be God's truth, God is not the author of the Bible. And as we advocate the things taught in this book, which are altogether at variance with the specter revelations of clairvoyance, we must go down with the Bible," unquote. So there we have it. And John Thomas has also kind of raised the stakes here. He believed in his interpretation of the Bible to such a level of certainty that if spirits do exist, then not only would his theology have been debunked, or exploded in his words, but that the entire Bible would have to be considered false as well. I'm pretty sure there are Christians who would disagree with that, but oh well, John Thomas doesn't care what they think anyways, and he's pretty sure he's right. This quote also shows that he was clearly aware of the spiritualist belief system as a threat to his own, because if it's true, then no one would have any reason to listen to his teachings since they don't align with that, and he would be at risk of losing all of his followers. However, if he can succeed in disproving it, at least enough to convince his followers, then he would be discrediting a huge contemporary religion and could potentially draw in millions of followers. It was a high-risk, high-reward controversy, and, arrogant man that he was, he didn't back down from that challenge. So this is the origin of the feud between the Christadelphians and the Spiritualists. So let's explore how Christadelphians have attacked spiritualist beliefs for over a century to try to preserve their numbers, and afterwards I'll share the one recorded incident I have found of spiritualists throwing it back at the Christadelphians in spectacular fashion. As I mentioned before, spiritualism basically holds the opposite views as Christadelphians on these topics. Their core belief is that there is life after death. Some spiritualists say that death is like stepping out of your clothes, but in this case, your clothes are actually your physical body. The person who died is then said to be in spirit and exists in a spiritual dimension. This transition is thought to be universal. There is no educational requirement, no attendance requirement at church services, no submersion in water requirement, and no dreamless sleep after death like the Christadelphians. There are no conditions. If you were alive and died, then you are then in spirit and enter the afterlife. That's it. Simple. The spiritual afterlife is said to be a safe, happy place, sometimes referred to as Summerland. The other thing to know is that spiritualists believe that you can still communicate with the people who are now in spirit through people with extrasensory abilities called mediums. So as I said before, if you believe a ghost exists, you share some beliefs with spiritualists. In general, they also believe that there is a higher power and that its existence is expressed through nature. So there's a strong reverence for nature, which I kind of love. It's a pretty peaceful religion based on love and kindness. Some of their beliefs include that people should do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and that we should be kind, do good, and others will do likewise. Even their belief in life after death is kind of heartwarming because most of the time mediums are just helping people connect with lost loved ones and share messages of love and support. There's no threats, no exclusive knowledge, no destruction, no abandonment, no secret meetings, no disfellowshipping, none of that. Just love, peace, kindness, and a hell of a lot of ghosts. I do want to add a quick disclaimer, since we'll be discussing mediums today, that not all people who claim to be mediums are honest or have a genuine ability to do mediumship. There has always been money to be made in fooling people, whether that's selling knockoff purses, people trying to trick you into sending them money on Facebook Marketplace, or even banks creating fake accounts to take money off their customers. There are a lot of people in the world looking to take advantage of others, and cold reading is certainly a thing. John Oliver actually did an episode of Last Week Tonight on mediums, so you can watch that if you want to learn more about deceitful mediums and watch them get embarrassed. However, because of the massive amount of fraud that was performed in the name of mediumship, much of which was historically exposed by Harry Houdini, of all people, the Spiritualists formed a governing body for their organization so that mediums have to pass tests in order to do readings in spiritualist communities. Basically, they regulated it. They also narrowed their mediumship abilities to remove any tools such as tarot cards, trumpets, Ouija boards, cabinets, chalkboards, and other Victorian-era tools and techniques that made it easier for frauds to trick people. A good medium will also never ask you for any information before doing a reading. That's important. Instead, they should be telling you information, not the other way around. Modern-day spiritualist mediums also give demonstrations of mediumship during the day at their services, in the open, off the cuff, for free. So if you think they're hiding in the dark or tricking people for money with a crystal ball, they don't operate that way, and there really isn't that incentive or means there even to do that. Instead, they have their reputation on the line and a public audience waiting. So bear in mind that spiritualist mediums go to great lengths to maintain the integrity of their readings and have a degree of regulation due to their affiliation with the group, which mediums who are not associated with the spiritualists won't have. Okay, so there was one more controversial aspect of spiritualism. Spiritualists were also closely tied to the women's suffrage movement in the United States. They have since assumed an apolitical stance, but in the early years, many key figures of the women's suffrage movement were associated with the spiritualist movement, even if they weren't directly members. Now, it may make a little more sense why the woman who was running for president was a spiritualist. She was a hardcore feminist. So that's just one more reason for Christadelphians of the 1800s to really dislike these people, since the Christadelphian system of beliefs relies on a patriarchal structure, which forces women to consider themselves as less than men, to be submissive to men, and for women to be content having less power and autonomy in all aspects of their lives compared to men. Once again, these religions were truly polar opposites in many ways. After all, spiritualist women had income, they weren't afraid to speak up, and they were leaders of that wave of the feminist movement, as well as vocal leaders in the political movement. These women were badass, which is another reason why their history is worth knowing. Spiritualism not only endorsed women's rights, but it was actually something that helped break down barriers for women by increasing the acceptance of women lecturing in public. Initially, the idea was that many women were said to be channeling the spirits of men, so basically it was a man speaking by proxy. But as the women's suffrage movement gained traction, many women began traveling to speak about feminism and why they thought America should have an amendment to the Constitution, specifically giving women the right to vote. So that's another reason why the history of spiritualism is fascinating, and another reason for Christadelphians to hate them. However, the biggest threat to the Christadelphians specifically was still that these beliefs undermined the Christadelphian sales pitch to recruit new members. Dr. Thomas gained followers by convincing them that he was the only one who had figured out how to have eternal life. He, and now the Christadelphians, alone have the truth. Like many charismatic leaders, he preached that only those who believed his teachings would receive this gift from God, a place in his kingdom on earth. If you believed his teachings, were baptized as an educated believer in his teachings, and were an active member of an ecclesia of fellow baptized believers who were baptized into that saving name, then you could earn your place there. It was not a gift for everyone, only for those very few, very special people. Meanwhile, the spiritualists were like Oprah on her old daytime show. You get eternal life, and you get eternal life. You're all going home with eternal life. Wow! Everyone gets free eternal life! So that certainly undercuts your sales if they're giving away something better for free. With spiritualism, you don't even have to be literate because you don't have to read the Bible. You don't have to spend a single spooky Sunday drinking symbolic blood and eating symbolic human flesh. You don't have to flagellate yourself for your so-called sins, or repent, or give up soda, or whatever. All you have to do is be a human. That's it. This difference in opinion regarding whether everyone would have immortality, or only a few people, was actually recorded in John Thomas's biography, Dr. Thomas, His Life and His Work. It is recorded that, quote, "If immortality be conditional, which the advocate affirms, then the dogma of the abstract human spirits or ghosts vanishes into air, thin air. If it be unconditional, as the abstract spiritualist maintains, then eternal life and immortality and incorruptibility is not the gift of God by Jesus Christ. For abstract spiritualism maintains that man, ever since his creation, has possessed an immortal spirit or soul, capable of existence separately and independently of his matter or body." Unquote. That makes sense. If immortality is not a reward for a select few, but is available to everyone, including people who don't know about or believe in Jesus, then that would make obedience and subservience to Jesus irrelevant, to be quite frank. That's a pretty freeing view for people who grew up in a Christadelphian environment, which revolves around Jesus and kind of this elitism of being part of a select few who have special knowledge and have to try to earn a reward. To the Christadelphians, immortality is conditional, so they have to strive to meet the conditions. So John Thomas had to think quick and do some damage control to retain and expand his following before they could join the Spiritualists and get immortality for free and stop showing up at the ecclesias. This is where his magazine comes in, because that is how John Thomas was able to answer questions that his follower had and continue to have influence over them while not being physically present, since he traveled extensively and was often reclusive. One of my favorite parts of these magazine articles is watching the Christadelphian viewpoint evolving and getting more insane as different Christadelphians tried to discredit spiritualism. I mean, if they had just attacked spiritualism the exact same way over time, that would make sense. After all, John Thomas had the one truth, so shouldn't he have the one answer for why his followers shouldn't believe in spiritualism? And if the Bible doesn't change, then you'd think that all these people who believe in the Bible would have a consistent reason for why they don't believe in spiritualism because of what the Bible says. But instead, they have tried to explain it in scientific terms, what spiritualism is and how mediums are just tricking people. But just remember, before we get into that electricity was a pretty novel thing during the time of John Thomas and Robert Roberts. The majority of American homes didn't have electricity until the mid-1940s. So these men in the 1840s and later, when John Thomas was preaching, didn't have the same understanding of science as people did in each successive generation. This is to be expected, since science progressively builds off existing knowledge and ideas over time. But the Bible should stay the same. So that's one reason why these arguments are interesting, because there's concepts that Christadelphians seem to be okay with all of a sudden, as long as it means that they don't have to believe in spiritualism. And it really does get pretty crazy, because Christadelphians wanted to disprove spiritualism so badly that they actually end up admitting that they believe in some pretty crazy stuff, but never the existence of spirits. So let's watch the historical Christadelphian argument against spiritualism evolve by looking at their historical publications. As early as 1852, spiritualism was already drawing the attention of Christadelphians. One member of the group, which would become the Christadelphians, named John Hoxie, wrote to Dr. Thomas that he attended a seance, which, first off, love that, and he wanted John Thomas to explain what the spiritualists were doing, because basically what he had seen was in, quote, direct collision with the views I have for years entertained, unquote, and that, quote, these things are facts, unquote. He doesn't elaborate, but the mediumship he witnessed must have been convincing, whether it was actually legitimate or not. It's also already interesting that Hoxie wrote a letter to ask his leader, Dr. Thomas, what he should believe, and to present the reasons against spiritualism for him, instead of figuring out what he believed for himself. Like, it's just, don't Christadelphians read their Bibles to find out the truth? And supposedly it's so obvious that you just have to read your Bibles to understand everything. So why didn't Hoxie search out his Bible and figure it out for himself? Instead, he's like, I'm going to write John Thomas a letter. And he wanted to know, like, the official opinion of a believer. And again, I say believer because at that stage, they weren't even technically Christadelphians yet. So he wanted to know what the official opinion should be and deferred his judgment, despite what he had witnessed and was claiming was fact. But this request illustrated a problem, because John Thomas really needed to find a way to convince this Christadelphian who had attended a seance, which, what a sentence, why what he saw wasn't actually real and why he must maintain his faith. It was urgent, too. Here's another quote from this gentleman, Mr. Hoxie, who attended the seance. He wrote, quote, now what I want to say is that this new delusion is the most dangerous one you have ever been called on to meet. The whole system promulgated in your writings goes down if the claims put forth by these spirit mongers are established. And it seems to me more important that you should attack and demolish this new opposition than that you should defend your position against any and all others. If you do not take up this subject and do it justice, you might not be surprised if your subscribers in these vicinities, where these things abound, fall away, unquote. Love this call to action. It's all about those subscriptions and keeping the funds flowing so that John Thomas can continue traveling and writing his books. This guy, who it sounds like was trying to go undercover to see what the hubbub was about, was also encouraging John Thomas to take an offensive position because he realized their message couldn't really compete, maybe. I mean, these seances were fun. All the elite people were going to these. Like, there was a genuine craze in America. But also, John Thomas never needed an excuse to attack another religion. He was always ready to pen some unnecessarily aggressive words about other religions. So he's like, hell yeah, I'll write an article explaining everything you guys need to know. As further proof that Mr. Hoxie couldn't quite figure it out for himself, he also sent John Thomas some of the issues he found in the Bible that he couldn't explain with the understanding that he had of John Thomas's theology. John Thomas's reply to these questions appears to be the first instance of the Christadelphians attacking spiritualism, but it also kind of put him in the defensive position, actually, of trying to reconcile Christadelphian views surrounding death with the Bible. Also, as we know, Robert Roberts was obsessed with John Thomas, so John Thomas's response to this question was also reprinted by Robert Roberts 16 years later in the July 1868 edition of the Christadelphian magazine, with glowing commentary from Robert Roberts. He praises John Thomas as having, quote, relentless acumen of a mind well exercised in the discernment of things new and old, unquote. And I just sort of love the weirdly specific compliments Roberts gives to Thomas because he's such a fangirl, as we discussed in episode 8. But apparently spiritualism was not only still popular in society almost 2 decades later when Roberts republished it, but by that time a Christadelphian who wrote to the Christadelphian magazine was saying, quote, "My children are powerful mediums," unquote, and asking for Roberts' opinion on what they call the miracle of this age, spiritualism. Roberts commented on spiritualism a bit, but I guess he thought republishing John Thomas's comments would be the best way to share his opinion because his personal opinion is that John Thomas is always right, you know? So before reprinting Thomas's article, Roberts also adds the quote, "Both the scriptural and scientific aspects of the question are exhibited with a clearness and fullness that leaves nothing to be done, and will speedily put to flight any lingering uneasiness that may be felt by those who, notwithstanding their acceptance of the truth, are perplexed with the signs and lying wonders of the great delusion," unquote. I have my doubts that his explanation is good. If Christadelphians are still unsure if spiritualism is real or not, 16 years after the argument was first presented. So we're going to take a look. Going back to the letter to Dr. Thomas, Mr. Hoxie actually writes something positive about the mediums as well. He says that, quote, "There are hundreds of mediums in this region, and most of them are persons whose character for integrity has hitherto been unimpeachable. Their answers are often surprising to all who hear, and present the strongest argument for the existence of spirits separate from matter that I have ever seen," unquote. So that addresses the first concern people have, which is, are all of these people claiming to be mediums liars and tricksters and swindlers? He's vouching for them that he doesn't think that they're dishonest people. However, I will say that there were frauds, and people would hide after finding out Harry Houdini was around because he would wear disguises and bust people for using tricks on people. So it did happen sometimes. However, some people such as the Fox sisters, Maggie and Katie, who are credited with starting the spiritualist movement in their home in New York, were actually strip searched, bound, and basically humiliated to try to discover if they were doing tricks. And people repeatedly could not find a reasonable explanation for the displays of mediumship that were demonstrated by these two women. There were no tools, no secret rooms, no helpers, no explanation for the sounds said to be communication from spirits. However, these women also briefly said they were liars to spite their sister, but then took their statement back. So it's always been really muddled in the history, and honestly, it's probably a mixed bag, to be fair. But if they are honest people who aren't trying to trick people for money, as Mr. Hoxie agrees that they are, then that basically means that spirits are real and that they're communicating with the living through these mediums. But that's just not gonna work. The problem is, it turns out there's some spooky stuff in the Bible. So anyone in this community attending these public events or private seances was really being tested on their faith and not able to find reassurance in their Bibles. And I don't blame them because most Christians do believe in life after death and they're reading the same Bible. So that kind of says that you guys are maybe interpreting things very differently than the wider world at a minimum. It's an ambiguous issue in the Bible, we'll say. But Christadelphians, claim that they're sure that the Bible says it isn't true. So, could spiritualism be disproven through the Bible, therefore defending the Christadelphian stance? So let's find out by taking a look at John Thomas's arguments from 1852, because they are a doozy. The first question from Mr. Hoxie was asking about the scene in the Bible where forms are seen by Jesus' disciples on the Mount of Transfiguration. Basically, for people who haven't read their Bibles recently, these guys from the New Testament saw some guys from the Old Testament. So these guys were supposed to have been dead for hundreds, thousands of years, but showed up and talked to them. And that sounds exactly like a ghost. If these guys, they are Moses and Elijah, are not alive during that scene, but are talking and interacting with people many generations after they had been alive, then what were they if not spiritual beings? Or are they cheaters and got resurrected early? Like I said, maybe God's plays favorites and they aren't ghosts. Not fair, but we already kind of said God's maybe not the nicest. So I'm going to read John Thomas's response to this one and see if you also notice that he raises more questions than he answers and then insults his readers to basically tell them they're stupid and to please stop asking questions. Okay, here goes. Quote, To question number 1, I respond that they judged of Moses and Elijah as they did of other men, and therefore called them by the right words, styling them two men. Whatever quibble might be raised about Moses because he died cannot at all affect Elijah, who never died, and therefore never experienced a resolution into two parts. But we need add no more. Moses died and must have been raised from the dead, or he could not have appeared as a man before 3 witnesses, wide awake, who called him such. There is no difficulty or mystery in this case, except with those whose minds are spoiled by philosophy and vain deceit." Unquote. Okay, so I hate to have to talk about the Bible, but he's saying that because Moses died and shows up again, that means he was raised from the dead. I'm curious here as to why he would have been raised from the dead, first off, because does that just mean like Jesus already came and we missed it the first time? Also, like, when was Moses raised from the dead? And finally, where is he? Like, is he in heaven with God? It's almost like Moses is in Summerland enjoying life after being dead, like the spiritualists claim, because I certainly haven't like seen him around, and apparently he has already received eternal life without having to become a Christadelphian, without baptism, without waiting for Jesus, without it being recorded in the biblical record, etc., etc., etc. Like, I thought the resurrection happened all at once, not like willy-nilly, like, maybe you'll get resurrected. Maybe I'll let this other guy get resurrected. Like, how did he get the limited edition resurrection? Is that available to other people? Are there immortals among us? Now we've got even more fanfic ideas because I read this book about a demon falling in love with a human and he was 600 years old. So if you're into age gap romance, the paranormal has you covered because Moses would be like 6,000 years old. So someone would definitely write about him falling in love with an 18-year-old like in Twilight, since his 2 wives presumably didn't get resurrected with him, I guess. So, lucky Moses. He remarried without getting disfellowshipped. Anyways, like I said, I immediately have some questions about this response. Some reasonable, some random, some disturbing, but questions nonetheless. And he says that Elijah did not die. Did you hear that? According to Christadelphians, the wages of sin is death. That's like a favorite tagline for them. The wages of sin is death. The wages of sin is death. So did Elijah not sin? According to standard Christadelphian teachings, if he sinned, he has to die. All humans have to die if they sin. That's why you need Jesus. The wages of sin is death. This was drilled into us every Sunday. That's why we eat human flesh, because we want to live forever like pious zombies. I also Googled this to see if Elijah sinned. Again, I'm not a biblical scholar. I'm not an expert in the Bible, and don't look to me for answers on it. And the internet says that there was basically a kerfuffle where Elijah apparently ran away because he was afraid of being killed in 1 Kings 19. Only after that, then he says he wanted to die, and people say that this was an example of his sin. Okay, I don't know if that's sin, but the internet says he sinned, and he was human, so he kind of had to die, because God apparently thought making sinners was a good idea right before realizing it was not a good idea to make people flawed. But if he did sin, then he couldn't live forever, because if he sinned, he has to die. And then it feels weird if God was keeping him alive forever, just waiting. Like in The Princess Bride, where he's like, hey, Elijah, I might wake you up and kill you in the morning. Which, again, doesn't sound like something a nice God would do. Like, I'll kill you eventually, but I haven't gotten around to it yet. Like, you have to go talk to some guys on a mountain first about something. Okay. And then there's Jesus. Jesus was the only person who has been claimed, to my knowledge, to be without sin. And that just makes this worse, because then either Elijah is also sinless, or the whole idea that Jesus is unique because he's sinless and died for us is completely overhyped. Or Elijah did die, contrary to what was in the Bible and what John Thomas claimed, but has been living in a resurrected body too, and presumably also in some sort of spiritual realm, since no one has seen or heard from him since. But if he didn't die and wasn't resurrected, but also was there in person, then at that point, we may also be going to science fiction territory, that God can just keep people alive forever without them dying at all, but he just chooses not to do that with anyone, including Jesus. Because as you remember, he didn't keep Jesus alive forever, he let him die. And this means that God only made an exception for Elijah, of all people, or he's like sci-fi bending time and space so that Elijah just shows up there whenever and wherever because time is an illusion. So I find this argument to be very confusing if you actually try to use logic and the principles of the Christadelphians to understand it. Like, seriously, John Thomas's explanation is honestly a pretty compelling case for spiritualism in my view, since you basically need to believe in magic or a spiritual realm to make it make sense, because there's so many contradictions with Christadelphian teachings, at least as I understand it. I mean, obviously I'm a little rusty, but I think I've roughly got it enough to see that there are some holes in this argument. If John Thomas's argument is true, then Jesus isn't even special, and the whole foundation of the religion then becomes a mess. The problem Thomas won't admit here is that there is no logical explanation here, and I'm guessing that his aggressive comment at the end about those whose minds are spoiled by philosophy and vain deceit is only there because he really, really doesn't want anyone to ask him to explain what on earth he's talking about. Also, by philosophy, he must mean like common sense or logic, and yes, my mind is affected by it. But this is just John Thomas demonstrating his power and preemptively silencing anyone who might want to challenge him. They're his followers, so of course no one will. But if they try to do so, the implication here is that they're simply too stupid to understand his reasoning, so he's shaming his followers into silence, essentially. Also, I like that he thinks that minds are spoiled by philosophy. It seems like a pretty direct way of saying he hates when people actually think about things from different angles so that they're not as easy to manipulate. So if you're in college, go take that philosophy class. Go spoil your mind with critical thinking abilities. The second question John Thomas was presented to defend was about Jesus, since the biblical record indicates that he didn't abide by physical laws of nature either. Amazingly, this isn't even about the time that he, came back to life. No. But it was about how he would appear and disappear after the resurrection. Just poof, he's there, and then poof, he's gone. And no one saw how he got from place to place. So the question was basically, why didn't anyone else besides the disciples see him? If he was still in a physical body that was basically human but somehow immortal, and again, don't ask me the science on that one, then shouldn't he have to travel in human ways and not like interdimensional magical ways? Also, just a side note that the guy who sent in this question also wanted to know if he will be able to appear and disappear at will after being resurrected, which is a great question. But I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Like, I personally would love to be able to teleport so I can travel more without it being so time and cost intensive. Like, seriously, I would be tempted to become a Christadelphian again if they guarantee that I will be able to poof anywhere in the world anytime I want. However, I also don't want people to be able to like teleport into my house anytime because I need my alone time. And someone's going to poof into your room when you're sleeping and scare the shit out of you or see something inappropriate. And you literally can't live that down when neither of you is ever going to die, since Christadelphians are allegedly going to live forever. Okay, so back to Jesus going poof. John Thomas really gets into the apologetics on this one, so it sounds like a standard Christadelphian explanation at first. But if you thought you knew where he was going, let me warn you that this is going to get weird as I keep reading. So wait for the twist on this one when I start the second part. In the first part, Thomas writes, quote, "The sudden appearance and disappearance of the Lord's body, or the Lord rather, for the Lord and his body are one and the same, was the result, not of any change upon him, but of an effect produced by him on the eyes of his disciples. Their eyes were holden, that they should not know him, until he thought proper to release their sight from the restraint. Mary saw Jesus, but did not know him for the same reason. The eyes of the disciples going to Emmaus were holden. The meaning of this is given in the words, and their eyes were opened, and they knew him. Hence, to hold the eyes is to shut the sight, so that though the lids be unclosed, certain objects shall be invisible," unquote. And let me pause for a second to pretend that this makes sense and take it all in. He's probably thinking, let's dive into our concordances and argue semantics, despite the fact that this is not a real thing that happens. But the Bible's full of magic, so sure, they're able to see things, but not see at the same time. Basically, invisibility cloak, like Hogwarts. I think a good Christadelphian would believe this explanation, sure. However, honestly, I'd be more inclined to say that he gave them prosopagnosia. This is an actual condition that someone I know has. People with this condition can't recognize faces and have to use context clues to recognize people. But John Thomas can only reference the science at the time, so he didn't know that condition existed. That would make way more sense. And he made up his own explanation that makes No sense. What does that mean to have your eyes held? It sounds like something Hannibal Lecter does. Like, gross. Also, if any baptized brother steals my ideas here for an exhortation because I'm brilliant, please credit me in this podcast. Thank you. Okay, so let's continue to read the rest of what John Thomas said on this because it goes right off the rails in the second part. I have to get ready because I am probably going to laugh during this part. Okay, quote, I have performed an experiment similar to this upon the eyes of a person now in this city in the presence of many witnesses. I first mesmerized him by looking at him steadily in the eye. By this process, the lids were closed so that he could not open them. I allowed him to remain in this state for some time, and then brought him out of it by a wave of the hand upwards and backwards. You could now see and converse with anyone. I told him to look at my finger, which I held before him, at about 6 inches above the level of his eyes. While he was doing this, I carried it obliquely upwards and forwards as far as I could conveniently reach, and then suddenly withdrew it from his line of vision. This left him staring with the eyes wide open upon vacancy, with a countenance as blank and inexpressive as a corpse. He was now in the state of ecstasy. His eyes were holden completely, for he could see nothing. In proof of this, a lightened candle was passed almost near enough to singe the lashes, but without causing a wink. Everything in the room vanished from his view with the jerk of my finger from the line of vision, and appeared again as suddenly as I waved my hands upward before his eyes, which opened them to the objects by which he was surrounded. The Lord Jesus, who understood man's physique better than all the living, operated upon the disciples more skillfully. He could close their sight upon some objects at once, while he left them capable of discerning others. In this way, he made himself invisible to them and entered with them unseen into their room, where he continued to hold their eyes until they shut the doors for fear of the Jews. When he opened them and was discovered standing in their midst, to their no little amazement, as may be supposed, when he parted with the disciples at Emmaus, he did not vanish as a figure from a magic lantern, but as the margin of the text reads, he ceased to be seen of them. That is, he took his departure. Just men, made perfect at the resurrection, will doubtless have the same power over mortals to make themselves visible or invisible as they please, by holding or opening their eyes. For of them it is testified they shall be like him. He was never seen so as to be recognized by others than his disciples, because it was contrary to God's plan that he should be seen by any others. He was only to be seen by witnesses, that his resurrection might be a matter of testimony and faith, that believers might walk by faith and not by sight. Therefore the eyes of all men were holden, except the witnesses chosen of God, and the Roman guard. So first, his argument is apparently that God hypnotized everyone around Jesus to teach them faith. Okay, sure. But more importantly, John Thomas was a hypnotist? Because this is very clearly describing him hypnotizing someone, which begs the question, if that is a real story, then where did this happen? Who is this man he claims to have hypnotized, and why? And if it's so easy, why did he have to use his hands, like his finger, at all? And if John Thomas had to use his finger and was doing what Jesus did, then did Jesus sit all his disciples down and be like, follow my finger, you're getting sleepy? Because that part was not in the Bible that I read. John Thomas insists that there were people there, yeah, but somehow this is the first and only time I found of this incident being recorded. So if you have any evidence of literally anybody who witnessed this firsthand, please let me know. Also, can you imagine if he did this in an ecclesia instead of an exhortation? Like, I would be a lot more tempted to go to a meeting to see him literally hypnotize his audience. But you also know that when someone found out that John Thomas was doing that, they would definitely pretend to be hypnotized to show how good of a supporter they were. And I say this because, as a dark comparison, apparently Jim Jones, who became famous for Jonestown, would do healings on his followers at the church. But it was found that he would plant people in the audience who would spit out chicken parts from their mouths and claim that they were spitting out their sickness. So, that's not how illness works, first. It also sounds very gross. But when you look at what's happening in that dynamic, that kind of shows that if you think someone wouldn't pretend to be deeply influenced by a church leader to help prove that they have special powers, then you're wrong, because they absolutely would. But I love that John Thomas went from talking about the phrasing of holding eyeballs, oh, what does that mean, to being like, oh, you think it's impossible that Jesus was able to cause a lot of people not be able to see? I can do that too. Like, okay, Dr. Thomas, you say you're not a prophet, and then you brag that you can do like miracles that Jesus can do and also hold eyeballs. Okay, interesting. Once again, John Thomas started strong and then just went completely off the rails in this rebuttal. Like, at least he didn't insult his readers on this one, so that's good. But he just brags about how he's as good at hypnotism as Jesus, essentially, which is absolutely bizarre and fantastic. Like, I couldn't come up with the stuff that I share on this podcast. Like, seriously, John Thomas hypnotizing someone to prove that ghosts aren't real was not on my bingo card. The third question from Mr. Hoxie was about why the patriarchs and prophets could see angels and what the young man with Elisha saw. So that's referring to an incident in the Bible with Elisha where God basically brought down the Rapidash fire Pokemon from heaven with a chariot of fire to pick up Elijah and bring him to heaven for an unknown reason. I guess to give him immortality, maybe, like according to John Thomas. Like, there's a theory. Maybe the Christadelphians will also travel exclusively by fiery sky chariots after Jesus returns. That makes the most sense compared to the teleporting theory that I had. So maybe that's the precedent for that. Who knows? But Dr. Thomas didn't go that hard on this one and basically just said that they saw angels with their natural sight. And if they didn't see them, then there were no angels or their eyes were being held again, which still gross. But okay, I guess they didn't see it, sure. The fourth question from Mr. Hoxie was asking where the Apostle Paul was taken when he went to the third heaven. I didn't even remember this one, so Google told me that the quote is from 2 Corinthians 12, and according to Google, that means that Paul went to where God is. Like, that's the standard theory according to the general public. But that's not what Thomas said, because that didn't jive with his beliefs. He said that Paul, quote, was not removed from earth, unquote, and, quote, he was wrapped in vision, unconscious of where he was, unquote. So no fun science fiction theories here. Boring. But boring as that may be, I do want to look at that answer a little longer, because this appears to be an example of Christadelphians, specifically John Thomas, just making stuff up. Because it repeats that, quote, he was taken up into paradise, unquote. It says right there that he went somewhere. He was taken somewhere. That involves moving, going somewhere. And again, according to Google, the Bible has lots of instances of people having visions, but in those cases, it would explicitly say that it was a vision. Habakkuk chapter 2, verses 2-3 references having a vision. Joel 2:28 says that young men will see visions. Job 33 references having visions. Peter had a vision in Acts 10. John had a vision in Revelation chapter 1. But what makes all of those different is that in every instance, it had said it was a vision. So why is Thomas saying that the Bible says it was a vision when the Bible clearly says that he physically went somewhere? It does not appear to be a language issue when elsewhere in the Bible it clearly specifies when a vision is happening. If the Bible is so clear about when people are having visions, then it should have said quite clearly, Paul had a vision, but it didn't. It never says that it was a vision. And if it never says that, then that means that John Thomas just completely made that up. So are you going to believe John Thomas, who is asserting something without biblical evidence? Or are you going to believe the Bible? Personally, I'm going to believe neither. That's just me. So it's food for thought, regardless of whether you believe in the Bible or not, or neither like me, because it's insightful as to the character of Dr. John Thomas. I also just want to point out that people having visions also happen in spiritualism, but somehow no one brought that up here. And it's funny because that's actually a nice little example of the Bible supporting spiritualist views, because as I mentioned, there are multiple instances of people in the Bible having visions, which spiritualists also claim to have. The fifth question from Mr. Hoxie was what Jesus meant when he said that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were already risen. This answer, I think, is gaslighting and circular reasoning at its best. John Thomas writes that, quote, he does not even hint, much less affirm, that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are already risen. He said that the dead are raised. Even Moses has shown at the bush when he called the Lord the God of Abraham. How so? Because Jehovah is not a God of dead men, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are dead men. Therefore, for Jehovah to become their God, they must become living men. For Jehovah is the God of the living, not of the dead. Hence the resurrection is necessitated. It is the only way the dead can become living." Unquote. So, first, I love that he's basically saying, don't listen to Jesus, listen to me. Because, yes, Jesus did affirm that because he literally just said, they are already risen. It sure seems like Jesus implied that they were already risen when he said, they are already risen. Seriously, this guy had to be gaslighting his wife at home because his reasoning doesn't make any sense. He's like, he didn't say that, but he actually did. And we have it in writing. I also find this answer so confusing because he just said earlier in the same article that Moses died and must have been raised from the dead. So why is he so sure that these three are dead, honestly? If you can argue that Moses is still alive somehow, then you should absolutely be able to believe that these three other guys are alive too. You literally just wrote an entire piece about how Moses was resurrected and was still alive at the time of Jesus. So why are you backpedaling here? It would be way more consistent to just be like, yeah, they were raised from the dead too because they're super special, but you people have to wait in line. Honestly, that just makes more sense to me. Especially because Abraham was older than Moses, so he definitely should have gotten immortality first, and he was more important to the story anyways, Father Israel and whatever. So yeah, Abraham should be immortal too by this logic, and it seems like the Jesus in this Bible story agrees with me. So I looked at the Bible verse in Matthew 22, and Jesus says that God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. Okay, well, talking about resurrection. Okay, so Jesus is affirming a resurrection, but it seems contradictory for John Thomas to say that it hasn't happened yet, when he already said that some people besides Jesus have been resurrected. He just said that Moses was raised from the dead. So why is he so insistent that it's in the future if he also says that it's already happened, at least in some cases? This argument feels like circular reasoning because Thomas starts his argument with the idea the resurrection hasn't happened yet. So John Thomas is interpreting Jesus' comment as referring to a future resurrection, even though Jesus never said it was in the future, and he said it had already occurred as of the present day. He never said, at the end of 7,000 years, God will resurrect everybody who believes in him. Nope. But that's what Christadelphians were taught and believe. So John Thomas basically claims that what he believes is true because Jesus said so. But that argument only works if you already believe that there's a future resurrection and use that belief to make an assumption about what Jesus is talking about. That's why it's circular reasoning, because you have to already believe an assumption first, and then you use the conclusion you draw from that to say that it's true. The problem with that is that the assumption was never actually proven in the first place, and then you're believing in something that was never proven to be true. In fact, I found that comment about Paul going to paradise in the third heaven made me think of that Bible verse where Jesus says to the robber at the crucifixion that today you'll be with me in paradise. Do you know that one? And what that sounds like is the spiritualist belief in Summerland after you die. I'm actively trying not to reference the Bible and be theological in this podcast, but it seems kind of easy to use the Bible itself to discredit this belief because the Bible seems to so clearly contradict his beliefs in many instances, and you kind of have to make stuff up to believe Dr. Thomas's theology. If John Thomas read that verse, would he be like, when Jesus said that you'll be in paradise today, he actually meant in over 2,000 years? Why? Because if you believe that Jesus died over 2,000 years ago now, because I'm recording this in 2024, and that robber is waiting for the resurrection to go to paradise instead of it happening right away when they die, like the spiritualists do, then that means he's still waiting to go to paradise this 2,000 and more years later. But the last time I checked, today and 2,000 years from now are two different times. So either Jesus in the Bible lied to this guy and omitted this really long waiting period, or John Thomas made stuff up to fit his theological views instead of using the Bible for evidence. So you can decide which, I guess, because as I said, I personally don't believe John Thomas or the Bible. So you do you. I'm just offering an outside perspective, and I'm mostly excited to talk about ghosts later in this episode. Also, in a beautiful piece of irony, John Thomas ended his comments on these questions by saying that, quote, "The Lord of glory dealt not in catches nor dishonesty. These are the weapons of spirit mongers, and of these who have more respect for the foolishness of men than the words of the living God," unquote. Oh my goodness, he is the king of irony. I just showed examples of John Thomas lying about what the Bible teaches, making up his own nonsense as fact, using circular reasoning to justify his claims, backpedaling on his own theories that he just made up, most likely making up a story about hypnotizing someone since it's sparse on details and evidence, and insulting anyone who doesn't agree with and challenges his ideas. I would argue that that is incredibly dishonest behavior and that he is trying to trick and manipulate people into believing his ideas. Honestly, kudos to the spiritualists for existing because they didn't do anything to John Thomas, and he just provided so much evidence for why people shouldn't believe him and should maybe consider these other views with an open mind. And I did mention that as we look at spiritualism, we'll actually see the Christadelphian explanation evolve a bit with theories about science, and that's true here in the beginning. Before John Thomas answered these questions, he actually wrote an entire article about something called odology. I doubt you've ever heard of it. It's spelled odology, odology. Odology was another theory of science about something called ode. Ode was thought to be life force energy that is visible in auras. The idea is closest to the idea of chi or prana. These are ideas of spiritual energies in our bodies. But ode also included theories about magnetism, light, and other concepts. The word odology was coined in 1845. So this was a theory that came to be around John Thomas's time, since the official founding date for Christadelphians was really only a few years later in 1848. I included a Wikipedia link for odology in the show notes, but never fear. John Thomas is going to explain what odology is for us in the pages of his magazine. Are you ready to learn all about a science that no longer exists? And from someone trying to explain it to others as an expert on it? Let's do this. John Thomas writes that, quote, Professor Reichenbach, in his experiments on certain crystals and persons through the medium of highly sensitive individuals, has ascertained that a fluid of a blue and yellow color, more subtle than electricity, is thrown off from the poles of the crystals and from the ends of the fingers. It is not visible to persons in a normal state of the nervous system, but when the brain is exalted beyond what is usual, though short of insanity, things invisible to others are perceived, which is presumably the electromagnetic fluid reduced to an aura by the peculiar atomic organization of the bodies from which it is given off. Of this fluid, Reichenbach also bestowed the name of ode. The electromagnetic ode is constantly passing off from the electrodes or poles of animal bodies in certain crystals. It is probably that our bodies are enveloped with a halo of it, like phantom ships at sea, produced by refraction of the lights reflected on the firmament from real ships. Phantom appearances are sometimes seen by sensitive nervous systems, produced by refraction of the odic rays in and upon the mirror formed by the magnetic halo of the earth, which emanate from the forms corrupting in the dust thereof. These phantoms are called disembodied spirits by the ignorant and superstitious, under the supposition that they are the real men and women, boys and girls, who used to enact life's follies in the flesh. They are no doubt as real as phantom ships, and as awfully mysterious to the unphilosophical and scripturally unenlightened as they are to the untutored barbarians. Unquote. So I'm going to try to summarize what I just read as best as I can for you. I think he's saying that there's an invisible fluid called ode surrounding our bodies, and ghosts are the reflection of these human odic rays interacting with the Earth's magnetic ode. But if you read your Bible, you'll understand that these spirits aren't real because only people who are scripturally unenlightened think that these reflections are of people who used to be alive. That's the theory he's going with. Ode is real. Ghosts are real, I guess, but they can be explained away by this odology theory as reflections that only ignorant people see. And once again, he's adding that aspect of if you don't believe me, I'm going to say it's because you're uneducated. Awesome. So let's keep going and see what else Bill Nye the Religion Guy is going to explain to us next here. Next, John Thomas explains more about what ode is. Quote, Our perception of latent electricity, or ode, can never rise to the highest penetration which is possible without the superaddition of something which the animal nature possesses. This something is the Spirit of God without measure. All living animals have it to some degree. Hence he is called light. The rays from his presence, called spirit, which are but one and the same principle, variously developed by the media through which is called by different names, such as electricity, magnetism. We breathe it. It pervades every atom of our bodies, and it exhales ode. Thus a circle or circuit exists. Unquote. Okay, let me try to explain this one too. What I'm getting from this is that ode is synonymous with electricity. They are somehow the same. But God's Spirit is also synonymous with light and electricity and also magnetism. So we breathe in God's electricity and breathe out the ode fluid. And this is a cycle, kind of like the rain cycle, but instead of water changing forms, we take in light or magnetism from God's Spirit and breathe out magical aura fluid. Okay, so this part is kind of one of my favorites. It feels very medieval to realize that as a society in general, they still didn't quite understand electricity at this time. And so they've all kind of just decided that it's actually God's Spirit. But Thomas also just keeps lumping all of these scientific ideas together, making this idea stew, which is just a hot mess. And I kind of wish that our guest Paul had brought this up to the brethren when he started talking about the Holy Spirit back in the day. Like, excuse me, but John Thomas said the Holy Spirit was electricity, so we need more light bulbs in this meeting room because I want to experience the full glory of his Holy Spirit, please. Like, if the Holy Spirit is electricity, there you go. Let's put in more light bulbs. But when you have a society where God is the foundation through which everything is interpreted, instead of interpreting it using logic, then scientific discoveries kind of have to be reflections of God. So, sure, the discovery of electricity means that God is electricity. This sort of old school mentality explains why people thought dying from lightning strikes was a direct punishment from God in the colonial days of America, too. But also, can you imagine someone installing the clap on, clap off lighting system in the meeting hall during that era? They'd be like, God is here. And then clap and the lights would go on and everyone would lose it. Because if God is electricity and the lights came on, then that's obviously God. It's not about clapping and electrical circuits. Nope. And this isn't the only Holy Spirit electricity quote. Here's another one for you from the same edition of the Herald. Quote, when God speaks to man, he speaks electrically, that is, by his spirit. For electricity is the term science has bestowed upon what the Bible styles spirit. When the Creator wills to speak, he does it by the same Spirit. In this case, a man in his sleep sees objects and hears sounds that have no real existence, but are representative of realities past, present, or future. These are the dreams and visions of the prophets. Unquote. We'll talk about the visions part in a second, but like, if you got an electric shock from something like static electricity, I guess just remember that is God himself shocking you because he is electricity, according to John Thomas. And this idea sounds so silly in the modern days, but I'm serious. Like, I guess Christadelphians really did, or at least were told, to believe that electricity was God's spirit in the early days. And that, again, could be a really good conversation starter if we're trying to understand why people choose to live according to how a guy with this understanding from the 1800s said you should live, or even govern a country using a document written during this time period, rather than growing and evolving to reflect modern issues and knowledge and use that to inform how you run your society. In the present day, I've never met anyone who believes that God is electricity, Christadelphian or not. They all understand that the sun, water, wind, coal, gas, all these other things produce electricity, and it's all about energy changes. So why are we pretending that everything this guy John Thomas says is fact when already some of his beliefs have been scientifically disproven? I think looking at all of John Thomas's writings gives some insight into realizing he was certainly not infallible and perhaps was actually quite eccentric in many of his ideas. In the June edition of The Ambassador in 1871, the Christadelphians published a little more on their beliefs in electricity and how that's how humans were evidently made. I'm sure your mom has a story just like this from the day she went to the hospital and you were born, right? Roberts wrote that, quote, electricity divinely manipulated and incorporated with dust, itself an electrical product, assumed the form of the divine image and likeness, and stood erect, a living natural body or man, unquote. So again, this horrific description of how life comes to be is scientifically untrue, since dust, which is my understanding is just dirt or ground, is actually how we stay safe from electricity because we ground electrical currents into the ground. Like, that's sort of the opposite of being made of electricity, in my view. I mean, it's conductive, but it's not like generating electricity or anything. And I wouldn't say that mixing dirt and electricity could create a human person. Like, I just don't think that contains all the amino acids and proteins that like our bodies are made from, plus all the water that our bodies need to have in them, that makes up most of our blood. Like, I'm pretty sure that women create humans. As much as sexist people don't want to admit that life comes from women, pretty sure that's usually the case. So I think the argument for the Christadelphians is looking pretty bad so far, because the more I reread these old arguments against spiritualism, the more I'm discovering that they're pretty frequently ignoring reality and making pretty wild claims. Like, I think human cloning would have been pretty easy if we only needed dirt and electricity. Like, why bother with the placenta stuff in the lab if you can just go outside during a thunderstorm and watch as babies are made when lightning touches down? Can you imagine? Like, you just have to run outside in the woods, like, trying to find babies under these cracked, burning trees. Also, to just go back to that other electricity quote for a second, I like that he supports psychic dreams, but he just claims they're from God, which was smart, because visions happen in the Bible. But he doesn't explain why mediums still have these psychic dreams and visions. He goes on about how they're liars, and he calls them names in his writings, of course. But he just said that God uses dreams to give messages. So if God is the cause of these psychic dreams, then the mediums must be chosen vessels for God? Like, that's awkward. I don't think he realized he said that. That's the implication of what he just said. But there was one medium who John Thomas supported. Jesus Christ, psychic medium. Which would be another amazing Broadway musical. If someone wants to write that, just give me some credit for the idea, okay? And I kid you not with this one, because I seriously can't make this stuff up. Just read the August 1868 edition of The Ambassador, which is in the Christadelphian magazine archives, or the July 1852 edition of the Herald. Let's see John Thomas twist the Bible to conclude that Jesus Christ was a medium. Quote, I can of my own self do nothing, saith the Lord Jesus. The Father is in me. The words I speak unto you, I speak not of myself, but the Father that dwelleth in me. He doeth the work. This proves what we have said, that Jesus was the Father's medium, through whom by his Spirit he operated on men's minds by words confirmed by miracles. Unquote. So there you have it. Jesus was actually a medium, and he must have been manipulating the odic fluid around men, since he was affecting people's minds using God's electricity, otherwise known as the Holy Spirit. So that's Jesus Christ, electric medium for you. And that probably would have been like a cute comic back in the day to try to get kids interested in the Bible readings. Like, I would have read that. Thomas also said that John in the Bible was made clairvoyant. So now I guess we have two mediums in the Bible, according to John Thomas. I am also so confused by this because I read the Bible before, and I've also seen mediums giving readings in a spiritualist setting as well. And I can say that they are very much not the same. Like, I think that's one of the problems with Christadelphians that I saw while researching this episode is that they're trying to argue against spiritualism, but they have to make assumptions about the group and go off that to criticize them because they refuse to associate with them and actually learn about them firsthand. But this does lead us to an interesting train of thought because he gave one more example of spooky stuff in the Bible while trying to disprove spiritualism. In his article, he mentions the story of the witch at Endor, who I mentioned in the beginning. And he says that, quote, the conversation between the spectral impression and Saul was carried on through the witch as through mediums at this day, unquote. Awesome. Okay. So what you're telling me is that what was happening with spiritualists has biblical precedent. You are saying that there are real mediums and that the Bible gives evidence for mediumship. Great. Another point for the spiritualists. Like, Did you forget what team you're on? Because you just said the witch at Endor must be a medium, and she was the means through which the message was able to go from the dead guy Samuel to the living guy Saul. I wasn't expecting that, and I don't even think he realized that his interpretation doesn't help his own case. Thomas did try to explain in a bit more detail how mediumship works, because obviously John Thomas was a man of science who could explain all of this to his followers. He explained what happens in scientific terms when he goes to visit a medium in his magazine, but don't forget that he believed in odology. He wrote, quote, "Now take two persons and make one a medium, called formerly a witch or wizard, and the other a consulter of the dead through him or her. In preparing the medium, you have rendered unusually sensitive the sensorium. Its electromagnetic halo is susceptible of the most delicate touches. Now place the seeker to the dead in rapport with the medium, and cause to pass from his sensorium a current of whatever you choose to call it, electricity, magnetism, ode, or whatnot. This done, there is a connection established between them which unites the halos of the two, and the witch sees and hears in dream sight and dream sound things which the seeker may have himself forgotten. But the relationship established is not limited to the speaker and the witch. Through her, it extends to all she knows, both living and dead." Unquote. Ah, yes, let's go consult the wizard. Come on, Dorothy. But now, how convenient that their halos of odic force connect, and the medium can now see and hear things that the person may or may not know. But also, the medium can also do that with literally anybody else too, somehow. Which, what's the point of fusing odic halos if the medium can already connect with dead people? Like, isn't the whole point that you're trying to make that the medium can't talk to dead people? But he's like, yeah, she has a relationship with dead people, but I'm going to distract you from that by making you think she has telepathy, essentially, and it's getting to the head of this person who is visiting them. And if it's not them, then it can basically be anybody else, because her relationship extends to all she knows, both living and dead. His theory is so wild and so complicated. Like, you can believe that a person still exists after death and can communicate through a medium. That's the first option, which Christadelphians refuse to consider. The second option is that you believe God is electricity, you breathe God in, he comes out as odic fluid, and when you share that odic fluid with a medium's odic fluid, she can read your mind telepathically to find memories that you had forgotten about someone who died, and the medium also has a relationship with the dead person too, telepathically, despite them being dead, and so is able to use her medium senses to pretend and mislead an innocent person to believe that a dead person is communicating with the person consulting them. Phew. Like, that's just so intricate and confusing and nonsensical. It seems like that involves so much skill, natural ability, and work just to deceive people. But that's what he went with instead of that, oh, maybe there's a soul. It sounds like Thomas just doesn't like the most straightforward, simple, and as we've seen, somewhat biblical explanation. So he made up another one, which is way more complicated, I think kind of reductive of God, honestly, and which has since been scientifically disproven in many ways as well. Unfortunately, it's the nature of science to keep moving forward. Any scientist will admit that there's always more to discover, and everything is a theory based on the current evidence. So it's easy in the modern day to look back and realize how premature these ideas were. But I will say that John Thomas's views of scientists sounds a little ironic. After sharing this wild pseudoscientific theory, John Thomas recorded that in his July 1852 edition of the Herald, quote, "The most scientific of men are comparatively very ignorant. Their knowledge of general facts is exceedingly limited, and their reasonings upon them, and their deductions very often, more often than otherwise, remarkably absurd. And yet it is the ignorant who undertake to draw conclusions from data the most recondite." Unquote. And yes, I had to Google recondite because that's not a word I use, and it means something that is difficult for an ordinary person to comprehend. So it's just another way for him to call scientists stupid, basically. Of course. And yet the irony is not lost to me that scientists have discovered that electricity is not God's spirit, and that the ignorant person making absurd deductions while claiming to be highly educated here is John Thomas. Oh, and as a side note, do you want to know how John Thomas became such an expert in odology? Because he tells us that too. Quote, From what I have read of spirit worldism, I have no hesitation in saying it is mere lying divination. I have a volume at my side, Cagney's Celestial Telegraph, or Secrets of the Life to Come Revealed Through Magnetism, a book which is full of this sort of thing, unquote. Wow, so surprising. It's almost as if John Thomas is reading all kinds of religious and spiritual books and magazines the whole time, which is a point I brought up in episode 2. Honestly, almost every time I mention John Thomas, I have yet another example of him reading secular writings on the subject. If this podcast does one thing, I hope it dispels the myth that John Thomas only read the Bible, because that is so obviously untrue for anyone who actually reads what John Thomas wrote, that he was reading extensively. All right. So after reading Dr. Thomas's rebuttal to spiritualism, I'm not convinced that spiritualism has been explained or that there's been a convincing argument to disprove it. I was able to poke pretty glaring holes into all of his explanations, and in some cases even examine it further to discover that it sort of provides support for spiritualists. However, reading this has been worthwhile, because I did learn that John Thomas is a hypnotist, people can hold eyeballs, telepathy may be real with living and dead people, Jesus Christ is a medium, and that God is electricity. Great. Thank you for teaching me about religion, John Thomas. Plus, I've also learned that John Thomas manipulates people by using insults to people's intelligence and circular reasoning. It's also funny to me because sometimes people will say something like, "Oh, you believe in ghosts? That's crazy. Like, they're definitely not real." And I'm like, yeah, that's fair if you haven't experienced all the things I experienced. Like, I get that. But then I read this historical Christadelphian literature and I'm like, actually, ghosts sound so boring compared to all of this. Like, this is a really wild idea to believe in. And there is a religion of around 50,000 people who think that this guy figured out the key to immortality and have dedicated their lives to this religion. Like, now that I'm out of Christadelphia, that feels wild to me. And yeah, now I agree with like 80% of Americans that there's something spiritual in us. That doesn't seem so crazy when you put it in perspective. And even when we look at some of these examples from the Bible. But this hypnotism, electricity, odology stuff is really wild. And I'm pretty sure most people would agree that there are some problems with these theories. All jokes aside, I love history. This is fascinating stuff I never would have expected to be in Christadelphian literature while I was a member. And no, we're not done yet. That was just John Thomas's rebuttals to spiritualism so far. And I'm not really convinced by the arguments so far. So let's see if future Christadelphians are more convincing in why we shouldn't believe in spiritualism. But for now, I'd say the case looks kind of weak for the Christadelphians. And if that's the case, then according to their logic, the case for spiritualism must be looking good because it's the polar opposite of Christadelphianism, according to them. In the July 1868 issue, they continue to assert that the Christadelphians are the more scientific of the two religions. Roberts wrote that, quote, "Scientifically, spiritualism begins by begging the question. The table moves. It does not ask the cause of the motion. It affirms it is attributable to the presence of spirits. It does not ask a scientific question to be pursued scientifically. Everything is assumed. The whole theory is an assumption from beginning to end." Unquote. I mean, I disagree based on my own experiences with both religions, since I have attended Christadelphian meetings up into my 20s, and I've also attended spiritualist services and a seance or two as an adult. So to comment on if spiritualism is based on assumptions, I'll share a personal story here, actually. When I lived with a ghost, and this is a ghost that over 24 people could corroborate as existing, so it was very much not like just me. People knew this ghost was there for a long time before I ever moved in, and the people who owned the building even hosted a paranormal night there for the public. Like, this building was haunted. And my friends experienced it, old employees who worked there in part of the building experienced it. Like, several dozen people can agree that there was a ghost. So I'm not even going to argue that point with you. So I collected images of the family of the spirit that I believed it to be from the historic archive in town. And then I asked the spirit to identify the people in the images. I was also able to contact and meet the still living great-grandchild of the spirit and showed the great-grandchild the same images. This is not the most scientific experiment, but in this situation, only a single image of a person was identified incorrectly by the spirit out of dozens and dozens that I had. And it turned out that that person who was misidentified in the image was someone who was not related to the family according to the great-grandchild. So that actually makes sense that they would be unsure of who it was. So adding that story to the other evidence I mentioned in my personal interview episode on this podcast, which you may not have listened to yet, I felt that I witnessed enough to have enough evidence to believe that the spirit was that person and that the spirit of that person was communicating with me. I needed evidence, so I also got that from a medium, paranormal investigators, the living descendants, documentation from the historic archive, as well as the physical experiences, auditory evidence, and other things that I experienced. So it's actually a really diverse amount of resources, experts, and experiences that convinced me. The paranormal will probably always elude science, but science is just believing the theory that makes the most sense and has the most evidence. And for me, I witnessed enough evidence to believe this theory. I really don't think I just made an assumption here at all. I was asking questions, reaching out to people who could verify the information I received. So it's as scientific as I was able to be in that scenario where many things can't be tested or measured. However, the Christadelphian beliefs, on the other hand, hinge on a book that they assume is true, the Bible, and they assume that they've interpreted it correctly, which I have my doubts about, just given the passages I've already shared in this episode written by Dr. Thomas. But as we already mentioned just a few minutes ago, their arguments and interpretations of the Bibles at times begin with an assumption and use circular reasoning as well. Again, circular reasoning means that the argument literally begins with an assumption, then claims that there's evidence for the assumption, but you have to accept that assumption as fact first before the evidence can even be interpreted as evidence. It doesn't start with the evidence to make the assumption. It starts and ends with the assumption. So to me, it seems like much of the Christadelphian beliefs rests on assumptions when considering those various aspects of it. This happens again in the April 1869 edition of the magazine, when Robert Roberts was trying to convince someone of Christadelphian beliefs. But that person was also curious about spiritualism. So this time, instead of arguing against spiritualism itself or instances in the Bible like Thomas had done, Roberts decided to use assumptions to try to get someone to admit that the Bible is true. And then if the Bible is true, then the Christadelphians are right. It was just a really bizarre line of reasoning. Roberts began by saying, quote, "We told him that without discussing the scientific bearings of the spiritualist phenomena, there was a ready mode of testing the pretensions of the system in a religious point of view. We submitted the following proposition. Spiritualism throws the Bible overboard. If the Bible is true, spiritualism, which rejects it, is false. This was assented to," unquote. So Roberts decided that he'll prove the Christadelphians true by disproving spiritualists while providing zero evidence to support Christadelphian beliefs. His idea was really just, I have to prove the Bible is true. So you would think that in the article, he would be providing evidence that the Bible is true. But he did not at all. This also seems to be a false equivalency because while yes, the Christadelphians and spiritualist beliefs can't be true at the same time, and one uses the Bible and the other doesn't require it, they're making Christadelphian beliefs synonymous with the Bible, and a little humility might be helpful here, because what he wants to discuss is whether the Bible is true or not, but he doesn't provide evidence for if it's true. And his next question that he asked was basically whether this guy had faith that the Bible is true. The guy agreed, yeah, I believe it's true. And he used that argument to try to claim that basically this guy's faith meant that the Bible is true. And if the Bible's true, then the spiritualists are wrong, which makes no sense. And again, there's just no evidence there. Also, if he did prove the Bible is true somehow, then the Christadelphians could still be wrong about their interpretation because there are so many other types of Christianity that rely on the Bible, and another group could in theory be correct. He might as well have said, if the Bible is true, then the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster is true. He had to conflate them first. That's not really the best argument to prove that your religion is true. It also doesn't prove that spiritualism is false. There are psychic visions and witches raising the spirits of the dead in the Bible, as we've discussed. And apparently Jesus was a medium. So someone could try to make the case for spiritualism to be biblical too. You just have to pick the right verses. There's just no logic to the premise at all to begin with. And the lack of logic makes my brain hurt a little bit. The argument is just nonsensical to me. Then it gets worse because he asked if this guy would believe if the whole Bible is true if Christ rose from the dead, which again is not how that works. Like, imagine you have a textbook for school written by a couple authors. Would you say that if one chapter doesn't have any errors or typos, then the whole textbook must be completely correct and free of typos and errors? No, you just made an assumption again. And if you're saying you believe something about one part of the book, then the whole book must be the same and true and correct. Like, no, that's not how that works. But the editor then continues to use the biblical record to try to explain why the Bible is true, but he just keeps asking the other person to accept more and more assumptions without providing actual evidence. And again, it's that circular reasoning. He's basically saying over and over, do you believe what's recorded in the Bible is true? Yes, then the Bible must be true. And that doesn't make any sense. To use the Bible as a reason why the Bible is true. It's like an American telling you that America is the best country ever. And you're going, okay, why? And they say it's because we said so. But I mean, you could look at the education, you could look at poverty, you could look at paid maternity leave, incarceration rates, maternal death rates, and question, is this true based on the evidence? But some Americans would just keep saying it's true because we said so, without providing any evidence. Maybe it is true. I've been told by other countries that they envy our clothes dryers and how we have all the different climates within our country and how many houses have attached garages for our cars. If you want to make an argument, present some evidence for your argument to make a case either way. I personally would measure it more by our health, our wealth, our education, more so those sorts of things than how soft and dry our clothes are. But it depends on what evidence you want to present. Don't just provide an assumption and then ask people for faith as evidence. When trying to convince someone, why would you insist that you don't need evidence? Because that's sort of what Roberts is doing with the Bible here, where he wants to manipulate someone using their faith into thinking that there is evidence, but he provides zero evidence for the Bible's validity or for the Christadelphian viewpoint specifically. By the end of the list of assumptions, he claims that, quote, the claims of spiritualism disappeared in the presence of the Bible as mist before the sun. It has no more to do with divine truth than Buddhism, unquote. Okay, not sure why you drag Buddhism into this. And what's funny is he admits that the other person wasn't convinced in the end as well. I think this other guy probably knew that something was wrong with this logic, even if he didn't have the words for these terms, which we now have. And this is still something that comes up a lot with skeptics, is that they'll say that people who believe in the Bible are using the Bible as evidence for their belief. And so it's always this circular argument without actual evidence. It's like, oh, the Bible's true because it says so. Well, can you prove it without using itself to prove it as evidence? So after looking at these so-called arguments and evidence, I'd actually argue that Christadelphian beliefs are the ones that are an assumption from beginning to end, as they claim spiritualist beliefs were, because they are trying so hard to make evidence for their beliefs. I even have concerns that the foundation is an assumption, since many of their beliefs about the Bible have been proven untrue by qualified scholars, as we'll discuss in other episodes, and they continue to use really illogical methods to try to prove their beliefs, as we've seen in this episode. So the Christadelphians took a break and waited it out, and their next attempt to discredit spiritualism that I found was to publish in January 1877 page after page of reprintings from two newspapers recording spiritualist frauds who were exposed in full detail. What's funny about this is they didn't include a ton of commentary on it, but it took up 5 full pages of the magazine with these elaborate stories of people changing outfits, hiding in cabinets, and so on. Robert says, quote, we make no apologies for giving copious extracts, unquote. And that was wild to me that they're saying their magazine is essentially supposed to be written by Christadelphians to expound Christadelphian teachings, but instead they're just reprinting gossip on another religion with no shame at all. So that was their next tactic to try to keep their followers from being curious about or believing in spiritualism. Just a plain old Jane smear campaign. However, despite this, Christadelphians remained curious about spiritualism, and in February 1888, the Christadelphians published an article called At Another Seance, where you guessed it, a Christadelphian wrote about attending a seance, this time in Boston, Massachusetts. This time, apparently some people pretended to be spirits, which was not uncommon, as I mentioned, and people would sometimes go in and out of cabinets and either get changed or have someone else in there who could come out pretending to be a ghost. So apparently these seance guests grabbed the fake ghosts and turned on the lights. So that was exciting to read about in the Christadelphian magazine. And again, this is why reputable modern mediums would never use a cabinet like they did in the 1800s, because it is too susceptible to frauds. Another brother wrote in as well, quote, If what was alleged by them were true, then our faith, we thought, must fall, and for several months we attended private circles, as well as the public meetings of spiritualists. There were many peculiar things manifested, but Brother W and I, being pretty well versed in mesmerism, having got our instruction from the most efficient mesmerist I have ever seen, we could account on mesmeric principles for nearly all that happened. There were 2 lady mediums, however, who, we were told, would convince us at a private sitting, and by arrangement we met on several occasions to witness their performances." Unquote. Apparently they were not convinced because the men said, quote, "Yes, I am perfectly satisfied. The whole thing is a humbug." "Why?" said Sister W. "Well," I replied, "I happen to be a Scotchman. My aunt was a Scotchwoman, and if she were capable of speaking at all, it would be in the broadest Lowland Scotch. My Aunt Hannah tonight, however, was as genuine a Yorkshire woman as ever you heard. We had a good laugh at the affair." This is a pretty similar argument to what I've heard from Houdini, where he had commented that a medium claimed to bring his mother through, and it wasn't her language that she spoke that he heard from the medium. It's probably a valid point, but spiritualism believes in not just clairvoyance, where they can see spirits, but also clairsentience, where they can feel the emotions of others, claircognizance, where they just kind of know information, and clairaudience, where they hear information. Because I have been to spiritualist services and I have talked to people about their spiritual experiences over the past few years, I have heard a lot of things from their point of view. So I thought I would just offer that information in this case because, yeah, it would make sense for a spirit to talk like they did in life, that I would make jokes and sound like this. But is that a rule that they have to? Because, if I was a mute in this life and I have no voice, would I not be able to communicate with my family at all as a ghost because I couldn't talk when I was alive? It just seems like there are people who have not had these experiences, who are trying to make up rules and then saying, "Oh, I don't believe in spiritualism because it doesn't follow the rules that I'm assuming it has." This guy absolutely could have been right and gone to a fraudulent medium. I don't eliminate that possibility at all. Did spiritualists ever actually claim and promise that they would speak in the exact same accent and manner as their loved ones? I don't think they ever did. So it sounds like the Christadelphians made an assumption then and once again jumped to a conclusion. I would much rather know if the medium was able to provide specific information that they could have known beforehand. Me and my partner share an account for something, and one day I needed a code that was texted to him because he's the primary contact on the account, and I was logging in and I needed that code. He knows that he shouldn't share this code with anyone else but me because someone could hack our account, whatever, if they got this code. So he sent me a text saying he got this code and he wanted me to prove that it was me requesting the code. So I had to text him something to convince him that it was me. So I did, and he sent me the code. That's kind of how mediumship should work. You shouldn't just believe them and be like, "Oh, that's you, sure." They should be able to provide evidence that they are speaking to the spirit of the person that they claim to be speaking to. There are absolutely things that I could share that only he knows, or if it was my sister, only things that she knows, and she would be able to say, "Oh, that's Zinnia. It can't be anyone else. No one else knows that. No one else would say that to me." But that information, does it always have to be verbal? I don't think so. Given that there are other senses besides just auditory that mediums get information through, and does it have to follow the same laws of nature that we have when we're alive? No, we're not even in human bodies, so why would we have to follow the same rules that we have now? So I know that's kind of weird and random, but that's just some of my thinking on that topic as someone with more background on this sort of paranormal spirituality stuff than the average person. To circle back to Harry Houdini, though, because I have mentioned him a few times, and he is the famous escape artist for anyone who doesn't recognize his name. Harry Houdini was mentioned in the February 1937 edition of the Christadelphian magazine. The Christadelphians did record some of his drama there by reprinting an article from the Daily Mail. Houdini and one of his friends, Harry Day, had investigated and uncovered fraudulent mediums during their life. So in death, they agreed that, quote, "whichever of us died first would attempt, if possible, to appear to the other," unquote. And they, quote, "arranged certain signs between us, known today only to myself," unquote. So the Christadelphians decided to share this news article because in it described that despite Mr. Day's efforts to be haunted by his late friend Houdini, he never witnessed any evidence of messages from Houdini from the afterlife. This also happened with his widow, who waited for a message from Houdini to learn if he was able to communicate with the living after dying. And in her case, it also did not happen, and she did not receive the sign from Houdini. Or at least, it did not happen until after she told someone what the secret sign was. So then when the sign did come, it was said to be false because she hadn't kept it a secret. And this is just another example of the lack of evidence for spiritualism too. Some people were waiting until they died to finish conducting experiments to test if it was true. And in that case, there wasn't evidence for it. But I mean, who knows? But the Christadelphians decided to publish that because, again, smear campaign. So back to the Christadelphians. In February 1895, the Christadelphians went after them again in their magazine, this time saying, quote, "The so-called phenomena have been no phenomena at all, but they've only been machinery and arrangement, darkened room and queer-looking cabinets and strange whisperings. The value, therefore, of the testimony is not scientific, but is simply temperamental, and therefore of no value at all, since it depends not upon the obviousness and sufficiency of the fact, but upon the receptivity or impressionability of the individual who testifies to them." Unquote. So once again, Christadelphians are saying that spiritualists aren't scientific, which implies that the Christadelphians are scientific and value science, which is quite odd to me since there are people in the ex-Christadelphian Facebook group that were literally disfellowshipped for believing in evolution instead of creationism. I mean, Christadelphian beliefs also don't have an explanation for dinosaurs and many other scientific facts from many different sciences, so that's a very hypocritical comment to make. Also, the whole belief in odology is another one. At the very least, science is not the basis for the Christadelphians. They aren't gathering together on a Sunday to read peer-reviewed scientific articles together, okay? In August 1913, the Christadelphian magazine once again published an article about the Spiritualists because they were furious that the Spiritualist National Union met in Birmingham. I guess the Spiritualists didn't know that Birmingham was already claimed as the capital of the Christadelphians. During this conference, the Spiritualists discussed that they were changing direction to reduce fraud. They said that, quote, "The communication with the spirit world had, he claimed, been greatly improved of late years. One of the most striking developments was the establishment of communications by means of direct voice, without the means of table lifting or rapping, or the trance entered into by a medium," unquote. This is the method that modern-day spiritualists continue to use to convey messages. Basically just getting information from their senses and sharing that aloud in their natural voice and with their eyes open. This change to direct voice was an intentional choice to reduce fraud while continuing to practice mediumship. The other quote I want to share from this article is when the editor wrote that, quote, "Telepathy and clairvoyance are the natural facts that underlie spiritualism," unquote. What? Telepathy and clairvoyance are the natural facts of spiritualism? Okay. I am still surprised by how casually the Christadelphian magazine wrote that Christadelphians should believe in telepathy. And you know what? I don't remember that part of the Bible where we're taught that telepathy exists. Aren't Christadelphians supposed to be a Bible-based religion? So is telepathy in the Bible then? I don't know. But I guess they still decided that believing in telepathy was more reasonable than believing in sentient spirits. They didn't mention the odic halos of fluid anymore, but the idea seems to be somewhat the same in that the medium is getting information from the person coming to see them. So it must be telepathy instead of now their halos combining. It's a weird theory since why would anyone bother to waste their money by going to a medium if all the information being presented is just coming from themselves anyways? That just doesn't make sense to me. I guess you could believe it's telepathy, but I think it would actually be more accurate if it is telepathy, because then wouldn't the medium say exactly what the person wanted to hear instead of trying to get information from a spiritual being, which would be harder and more prone to error. I also lived with a ghost before, as I mentioned previously. So I personally think that it makes more sense that spirits exist than that telepathy is real. If telepathy is real, mediums should already know my name and what I'm thinking before I even introduce myself and things like that. But I've never experienced that sort of interaction with anyone. They also sometimes get things wrong. They will admit that. And sometimes they'll say something that is confusing to the person getting the reading and that they advise that they should check later. If anything, mediums go out of their way to know nothing about you so that their mediumship is less tainted with assumptions. So they don't seem to be telepathic or have any interest in that at all. Again, that is a viewpoint that I have just from being around professional and not professional mediums. But if the Christadelphians have evidence that telepathy is real, I would be curious to see it. After all, they're so scientific and they're so sure it's telepathy. So they must have evidence for that, right? I also was reading one book about spiritualism, and in it, a journalist who is not a medium, for the record, just a journalist, mentioned that a medium in Lilydale said that she was impressed with another medium who was estimated to be correct about 90% of the time. Why 90%? Because mediums typically don't claim to be correct 100% of the time, and she was saying that that was a really high percentage. I imagine it's a bit like a whisper down the lane where things get a little garbled in translation. I've seen this too, as I was either able to disprove or not able to corroborate a few things I was told from the ghost I lived with. Eventually, maybe someday I could try to quantify it by writing all the statements and checking how many were true or false to see what the percentage was, but I haven't gotten around to that. Maybe I never will. But I have to agree based on my personal experiences that it's not 100%. I don't think the communication would be 100% accurate, but I do think it tends to be more accurate than inaccurate. Also, you may be thinking, oh, like maybe he was just being sarcastic that telepathy is real? Like, okay, well, to talk a little bit more about this, let's open up the June 1955 edition of the Christadelphian magazine, because this one is a little more clear. They share another story to try to ridicule and tear down the spiritualists, because clearly defending their own ideas hasn't worked well, and by the 1950s, the theory of odology was long gone. But while recording their article trying to expose a medium as a fraud again, they wrote that it was, quote, a marvelous demonstration of telepathy, unquote, and, quote, an example of the telepathic powers of a gifted medium, unquote. They also record that, quote, the metagnomic faculty in man, commonly called telepathy, by which a person thus gifted can obtain access to information otherwise unavailable to him by his five senses, is a natural and convincing explanation of every one of the genuine phenomena of spiritualism, unquote. So they really doubled down on telepathy. They had no hesitation with complimenting mediums, as long as it was on their telepathic powers, in fact. But in the July 1955 issue, we also learned from the Christadelphian magazine that not only can mediums apparently read minds, but that they can move and create objects using their minds. They record that quote, the cause of the genuine physical phenomena of spiritualism is simple yet wonderful, that the subjective mind of man possesses physical as well as mental power, can create substances which can be seen and felt, can produce images and forms which a camera can record, and can move objects, unquote. Seriously, why are you even trying to discredit them if they can create real substances and move objects with just their mind? If that's true, then you should just convert, I would think. And again, much of that really impressive stuff was fraud, to be clear. But it's so interesting to me that the Christadelphians were supporting the phenomena reported by spiritualism, but just changing the factors believed to be involved in it. Like, I don't even know how they got there, but it's like they're now trying to make room for both to be true. Like, yeah, these people are magical and have special abilities, but we really want you to not believe in spirits, so you can believe everything about spiritualism except for the part about ghosts. I've already said that there were a lot of frauds who claimed to be mediums back in the day, so that person may well have been. But from what's recorded in the magazine, the person consulting the medium in the 1950s for this article was also kind of a fraud, since they were lying and trying to manipulate the medium. So if you have an issue with lying, you might want to look in the mirror, dude. And I also imagine that it's difficult to get an accurate reading if you are actively lying to the medium. So it's just kind of a weird story that they published, and I don't think it reflected either group really well. But moving past that, the biggest takeaway from me is that the Christadelphians were publishing in their official magazine that they believe in telepathy. And I remember reading books like this when I was a kid, like The Girl with the Silver Eyes, who has telekinesis and telepathy, or like Matilda, where she has telekinesis. These were fiction books for children. However, this religious magazine for adults is publishing stories claiming that telepathy is real. And the best part is that they aren't including any Bible passages to support it from what I saw. And I personally don't remember any instances in the Bible of telepathy. Again, it seems like they're willing to make something up that wasn't in the Bible and that isn't supported by science in order to cling to their beliefs that spirits don't exist. They always claim to be based on the Bible or to be based in scientific facts, as we've seen, but it keeps coming back to them just believing anything that confirms what they already believe. So if believing in telepathy allows them to continue believing Christadelphian doctrine, they'll do it. And I'd say that's another red flag if you're trying to figure out if that group has attributes of a cult, because I think it's pretty extreme to bend your reality around a belief system to make sure it fits with the beliefs you are told you need to have, instead of letting the things you experience and the things you learn from reputable sources inform your beliefs. I don't even ask that you believe what I share. I provide as full a reference list as I can for every episode. So if you don't believe me, it should be pretty easy for you to look it up for yourself and decide for yourself. But you're starting to get into cognitive dissonance when someone is willing to believe something that is untrue in order to continue believing in an assumption that they have a personal investment in. Also, the Christadelphians have just explained that there are people who can read minds, move objects with their minds, and create objects with their minds. So I'm just saying that sounds like a pretty good reason to switch religions to me. Like, sure, I can sit around with the Christadelphians reading the Bible all day, or I can create matter like a god. Like, hell yeah, I'd rather be doing that. Sign me up. Why would I want to waste a lifetime waiting around for Jesus when apparently the spiritualists can get immortality without all that work and waiting without having to worship God forever as a trade-off, and they get to do badass stuff during this life? Like, I don't think that was the writer's point here, but that's the point I'm choosing to take away from this. Because at this point, it's just a sales pitch for spiritualism because they make it sound really cool and fun. And now it's time for a word from our sponsor. As the year winds down, we understand that things may seem dark after so much negative news, political drama, and global uncertainty in the past year. Maybe in these dark times, you find yourself looking for some comfort and community to get you through. It's natural for people to be looking for answers and messages of hope through their religion. For many people, religion can provide meaning and connection for those people feeling adrift or scared in the modern world. But maybe your religious group is stoking your fears of the end times or causing more strife than peace in your circle of friends and family. If so, maybe you found yourself searching for a new religion. We understand that not every church is focused on your needs. Perhaps your church has implemented a strict dress code that's targeted your gender, or maybe they ask you to do homework like Bible readings and attending classes during the week when you're already feeling so overwhelmed by your to-do list. Or maybe you're tired of singing songs from the 1800s, but no one will let you talk about changing them. If this sounds like you, why not consider becoming a spiritualist? The spiritualists are open to singing modern, upbeat music, allowing you to dress however you want, and won't ask any invasive or controlling questions about your lifestyle outside of the church. Some churches want you to sit around reading the Bible all day, but not the spiritualists. Say goodbye to Bible study and say hello to ghosts. In fact, just ask Christadelphians and ex-Christadelphians about the spiritualists to hear rave reviews. One Christadelphian calls spiritualism the miracle of this age. Another describes their services as a marvelous demonstration. And one even says that spiritualists have the facts. Some Christadelphians even say that spiritualists have telepathic powers. Don't you want telepathic powers? Other religions can't offer that, but the spiritualists can apparently. Wouldn't you rather have magical powers instead of homework after attending services on Sunday? Take charge of your life and choose a religion that helps you live a better life. Wouldn't you rather receive an energetic healing than continue the cycle of generational trauma? Wouldn't you rather hear from an actual ghost than reread stories about dead people who may or may not have even existed and also were recorded to practice polygamy and incest? We understand that your choice of religion is personal, but when it comes to your lifestyle, why not consider a religion that practices unconditional love and acceptance and never kicks people out for ordinary aspects of their humanity, like their marriage, sexuality, or civic engagement? Maybe it's time for a new year, new religion. The spiritualists are a great choice if you're tired of your old religion. After all, why stand around singing hymns to the God of the living when you can hang out with the dead? Please note this advertisement is literally a joke, and there's no expectation of anyone actually changing their religion at any time, and there's no guarantee of developing telepathic powers by attending their church services. We wish you a happy holidays and that you're home to be free of ghostly hauntings, Bigfoot, unexplained drones, UFOs, and family drama. And now, back to the show. Unfortunately, as much as Christadelphians were always trying to point out their differences with the spiritualists, The larger religious groups in Birmingham actually grouped them together in July 1919, and it royally pissed them off. The Birmingham clergy wrote 4 different pieces on the danger of other religions, which included both Christadelphians and Spiritualists. The Christadelphians, in response, recorded that, quote, "As to spiritualism, Christadelphianism is infinitely more opposed to these than is the Church of England, but these things do not concern us now," unquote. Yeah, it didn't concern them because now they had to fight the Church of England in their magazine and focus on that. Around that time, in July 1919, the Christadelphian magazine reported that the editor of the magazine at the time, C.C. Walker, had presented a class against spiritualism and discussed how in the time of Moses there was, quote, "wizardry and necromancy, all of which things were dominant features of ancient life in Gentile nations. They had their origin in Babylon." And let me tell you, Babylon sounds so nice. It sounds like Hogwarts, where cool and magical stuff happens. And for anyone wondering, I would be a Ravenclaw. And I'd also be enjoying like the beautiful gardens in Babylon, because they're like the hanging gardens. That sounds so pretty. But to Christadelphians, Babylon is also slang for like the ultimate evil people. So that's all supposed to be a bad thing. And by comparing spiritualism to Babylon, that's just another insult, even though it sounds pretty awesome on the surface. C.C. Walker also decided to tackle the topic of the witch at Endor in the Bible. That was the one that John Thomas had previously written about and claimed that the witch was a medium who conveyed the message from Samuel to Saul. Walker decided to write his own interpretation of the biblical account by saying, quote, "There was no real presence of Samuel," unquote, because I guess he decided he was authorized to rewrite the Bible. Like, honestly, at this rate, it almost wouldn't be surprising if someday a Christadelphian version of the Bible was published, because it could omit all these inconvenient verses so that they wouldn't have to do all the apologetics. Rather than believe what was written, which I was under the impression was the Christadelphians' whole deal, Walker went with the telepathy idea mentioned by Christadelphians after Thomas. The article recorded that, quote, "The admitted fact of the influence of one mind upon another were enough to show that there was no real presence of Samuel," unquote. Oh, of course, because the medium read his mind, apparently. It's all about the influence of one mind upon another, this theory. The problem with this is that in the Bible, again, you're making me read the Bible, 1 Samuel 28, it says that the woman saw Samuel and cried out and repeats that she saw him, and that Samuel then spoke directly to Saul, and that Saul replied directly to Samuel's ghost. I don't think visualizing something in your mind would freak someone out, but seeing a spirit definitely would. I also don't think someone could reply to a comment made inside someone else's mind. Like, how do you have a conversation like that? Please show me. Please do a live demonstration at your ecclesia if this is real. And it doesn't even say like, oh, the witch was doing the talking. It's saying like Samuel said to Saul, Saul said to Samuel. So all the evidence in this biblical story points to a spirit showing up and talking to a living person here. I also love that C.C. Walker did the same thing of making up rules for spirits despite claiming not to believe in them. Like, why do you guys love making things up? And I say this because he wrote that another reason Samuel's spirit couldn't have been there and showed up was because he wasn't buried in Endor. Here's what he said, quote, "Samuel was buried at Ramah, many miles south of Endor," unquote. Like, what is this argument? We're all agreeing that Samuel is dead. We're on the same page there. But, like, do you think that the laws of physics apply to human spirits and he has to, like, dig himself out of his own grave and, like, walk the whole way? Like, he doesn't have a body anymore. That's the whole point. It doesn't matter where his body is buried. Like, Christadelphians, I guess, believe that their bodies can be resurrected, that they can live forever. Maybe they can poof and teleport. They believe in telepathy in actual humans, supposedly, historically. But a spirit being able to just poof is too outside the realm of belief. Really? Like, I don't think that's any more extreme than the other beliefs that have been published in this magazine. It seems like Walker's arguments were just trying to rewrite the Bible to pretend it says this whole situation was just a witch telepathically reading Saul's mind, and then trying to say that spirits, which you don't believe exist, aren't recorded factually enough for you in the Bible. Like, oh, should Samuel have had a hiking backpack and a shovel in this story? Because you've decided he needed to act like a living human for some reason if he was a spirit, but also he's not a spirit and it was all in their mind. Like, I'm pretty sure ghosts just appearing out of nothing is kind of on brand, actually. Like, maybe he was just confused and thinking of zombies, and that's kind of more a Christadelphian thing, because Jesus was kind of a zombie. Like, if you hear me out, the definition of a zombie is a corpse that's been revived by the supernatural. Jesus was supposed to be revived by God's, like, magic spirit, whatever. So they're basically the same, but one of them didn't want to eat brains. So if you can believe in the dead coming back to life, why not ghosts, really? But Christadelphians really don't want to believe in ghosts, as documented throughout this episode. And C.C. Walker writes that he actually has a cure for belief in ghosts. He writes that, quote, "The remedy for spiritualist tendencies lay in constant reading of the Bible, in the study of God's promises in Christ, in belief of and obedience to the gospel of the kingdom of God," unquote. So one thing that I doubt he knows is that many spiritualists are Christian and read or believe the Bible. Not all of them, of course. But Christian beliefs are accepted within the group, and they're really into the idea of angels too. So again, Walker is kind of wrong about that, actually. It's not a remedy to read the Bible because they read it too. Some of the books available at the Spiritualist bookstore in Lilydale are entitled Spiritualism and the Bible Connection, Spiritualist View of the Bible, and Christian Bible, Its Prophets and Mediums. And there's even more about God, including God Made Easy. And again, these historical Christadelphians, it seems like, just made assumptions about the spiritualists, so they got a lot of things wrong. But it does reinforce Christadelphian culture because the culture and traditions revolve around reading the Bible. I think it's possible that part of how this group exerts control of their members may be by requiring attendance at their services, as well as encouraging this homework to keep loyalty to the group and its doctrines at the forefront of their members' minds. After all, if you read your Bible every day, you're creating this ritual that shows your loyalty to the group through the effort you're putting into it. Then every weekend, they have someone stand up to remind you what you believe and reinforce your social bonds to the group. So it makes sense for them to basically say, just keep reading your Bible and listening to our lessons on it. That will keep you safe from believing something else. And it will, because you're continuing to be indoctrinated by the group. After these examples from the 1900s, I originally thought that maybe Christadelphians stopped talking about spiritualists, but then I discovered that the former editor of the Christadelphian magazine, named Michael Ashton, wrote a pamphlet on spiritualism in 2004 called Spiritualism, which is an interesting pamphlet. The summary of spiritualism is actually pretty accurate, but then I kept reading, and he says that, quote, "During the reign of Israel's first king Saul, he felt the need to consult a spiritualist medium," unquote. That's kind of impossible, since spiritualism didn't exist until the 1800s. So if it was a medium, then it was just a medium. Or some translations of the Bible, as we've said, have called her a witch, the Witch of Endor. So that's kind of rude to just use witch and spiritualist medium as interchangeable, actually. And this wasn't just one mistake either, because Ashton actually writes throughout his book as if spiritualism is in the Bible, which, for the record, that term is not. He included the history of spiritualism and how the movement began in the 1800s. So he is well aware that that time period in which events in the Bible were supposedly taking place did not overlap with the religious movement that started in the 1800s. They were not happening at the same time. Ashton then goes on to say that this woman, who he just called a spiritualist medium, wasn't actually a medium at all, because, quote, "There did not need to be any communication with the dead for the woman at Endor to tell Saul of the impending disaster," unquote. Well, if he didn't need someone to tell him, why is this story in the Bible at all? I thought God didn't make mistakes and everything was recorded in the Bible for a reason. Also, just historically, men love writing women out of history, so why not just say that the king fell asleep and he had a vision? That would be really convenient to get rid of this inconvenient woman and a woman who can talk to the dead, according to what's recorded. Also, I already talked about this story multiple times in this episode. We can't get away from it, so I've had to keep bringing it up. And I still think that it seems like Christadelphians are trying to rewrite the Bible to pretend it doesn't say what it says. We've already seen they can't agree on whether she saw a ghost or not. And if she did, how the communication happened. And yet they claim they believe what the Bible says. I mean, just lean into it already. Every Sunday is Spooky Sunday with drinking blood and eating flesh. This is the Word of God. And if He wants you to believe in witches and mediums, then that's what you should believe. I didn't write the book or tell you to believe it, so take up your complaints with God. Why is it so easy to believe something like that gay people are bad from the most minuscule comments in the Bible in the Old Testament? But when a witch says she saw a ghost and screamed because it startled her when he showed up, you say that the Bible doesn't have ghosts in it, that they're not real. I thought you weren't supposed to pick and choose. You claim you believe what's in the Bible, so stop with the apologetics on this one. It's ghost time! So to summarize their arguments that we've gone through today, we've learned about Christadelphian views on odology, electricity, telepathy, and telekinesis. We've also seen that when they're presented with something in the Bible or in the world that doesn't make sense, they're willing to use some pretty illogical means to try to discredit it as well. It doesn't seem like these historical Christadelphians wanted to know the truth of the matter, but instead wanted to maintain and protect their understanding of the Bible, even if that meant utilizing circular reasoning, making false equivalencies, having cognitive dissonance, and even flat out ignoring certain passages of scripture or pushing a now debunked science and asserting that telepathy and telekinesis are real. I would imagine that this is pretty surprising to you because it was to me. But I also found one other surprising tidbit about historical Christadelphians while I was gathering research for this episode. Let's go back to Robert Roberts for a minute, because in his biography, Robert Roberts, A Study of Life and Character, there's a mention of a Christadelphian who is apparently a psychic. Let me share this story of a man named David Handley. The story goes, quote, David was more remarkable for certain psychic powers which were regarded as uncanny by matter-of-fact friends, and perhaps by some suspected of being profane. From more than 60 years ago, there floats back to memory a story of David Handley told at the family table, a story perhaps readily forgotten by the older members who heard it, but making an indelible impression on the mind of the youngest, who was only a child. One night, the narrator said he had been unable to sleep. A conviction formed in his mind that someone wanted him and was sending out urgent waves of thought appealing for help. He was unable to resist the vague call. He dressed, harnessed the horse, and went out in the night, not knowing where he was going. As he drove down a deserted street lined with dark houses, a bedroom window was suddenly thrown open, and a man called, David Handley, is that you? I've been praying for you to come. Either the narrative went no further than this, or at this point memory fails. So if any reader wants to know the nature of the trouble which apparently so gave wings to thought, such curiosity cannot be gratified in this record, unquote. Ugh, what a terrible ending. I want to know why he needed David to come to his house so badly. But isn't it interesting that even among Christadelphians, there was at least one person reputed to have psychic ability, and it was recorded in their books? Like, psychic ability is typically associated with mediums. So I do wonder if he also had experiences of getting messages like this from the dead. I'm also glad that people enjoyed this story, because I could see his Christadelphian family getting so mad that he wasn't fitting into their mold of who he was allowed to be. And this metaphysical stuff is way more aligned with spiritualism than Christadelphian culture. But then again, isn't that kind of how it goes? People aren't different just to be different and annoy others. They're just born that way. And it's society that judges them and makes those differences somehow bad. Also, there is a difference between mediums and psychics, which I'll just throw in here. A medium can connect with spirits of the dead, while a psychic has extrasensory abilities. David would be a psychic because he was able to get this message from someone who is alive. He was able to pick up this nonverbal message. If that person had been dead, he would be called a medium. So mediums are a type of psychic because they can receive sensory information that others can't, but a psychic like David may not be a medium and have that ability to talk to the dead. Okay, so we went through a lot today, and I know these episodes are long, but I have been saving my favorite part of this drama for last, and I hope you enjoyed this last story as much as I do. We're going to talk about the death of John Thomas. And no, this isn't about his beard, as much as you know I'm not afraid to bring that up. This is actually about something that happened after the doctor died and after he was buried without his beard. So the story goes that after Dr. Thomas died in March of 1871, by that autumn, his ghost had returned and spoken to some people who used to be Christadelphians, but had left and become spiritualists. Yeah, you heard me right. Now we get to talk about John Thomas's ghost. And the best part is, This is also recorded in the Christadelphian magazine. Like almost everything I've shared with you today has been straight from official Christadelphian historical resources, mostly biographies and their magazines. But I'm pretty sure that if I reached out again like I did with the beard, they would be like, oh, that's just a silly rumor. It may be a rumor, but you reported it, and I want to know everything. I wouldn't have even known about this if the Christadelphians hadn't been so excited to try to clap back at the spiritualist community and publish a rebuttal in the Christadelphian magazine. This story is also so wild that I'm going to read almost all of these 3 articles that cover the story because it's all too good. The first excerpt I'm going to read for you is called A Visit from Dr. Thomas's Ghost, from the November 1871 edition of the Christadelphian magazine. This is what Robert Roberts wrote when he learned that some ex-Christadelphians claimed to have been contacted by John Thomas's ghost, and that the ghost had said that he was wrong about Christadelphian teachings and apparently stated that his book should be burnt. Roberts writes that, quote, "It is reported that Dr. Thomas, or his supposed ghost, has been at some table leg in Leicester, telling the listeners that he finds he has been mistaken in the teachings of his lifetime, and asking them to advise his friends to burn all his books. We ought very likely, on hearing this announcement, to have trembled at the knees, and solemnly proceeded to arrange for a bonfire of the precious archives confided to our custody. If Dr. Thomas is alive and wants his books destroyed, why doesn't he come to the Athenaeum rooms and deliver the message where it might take effect? It is rather a suspicious fact that his ghost should happen to turn up only in a circle where he is known and detested, and which happens to include among its adherents a family of misguided persons who ran almost violently well at first, but who have been seduced from their allegiance to the truth by the flesh and bewitched by ancient sorcery newly revived. Let them be reasonable and bethink themselves. If Dr. Thomas be alive and want his books destroyed, why doesn't he come and do it himself? Have not spirits power to lift tables? Can there be any difficulty then about lifting a taper and applying it to the Athenaeum buildings? What easier than to lift all the books one by one into the fire while the office is closed and everybody absent? And seeing there are 20 times more in circulation than are to be found in the office, why not Dr. Thomas league himself with a band of spirits who shall make it their business to prowl throughout the world, and in every house where they find a copy of Dr. Thomas's work, lift it into the fire while its owner is in bed? Perhaps it is an impostor spirit. How can they be sure it is not? At all events, impostor spirit or true spirit. Again, we say the Leicester Dr. Thomas spirit cannot be the spirit that dwelt in Dr. Thomas's body, that dwelt in West Hoboken, for the latter spirit was a wise and practical spirit, which caused Dr. Thomas's body to firmly and wisely do what it saw wise and desirable to be done, but which, did it now alive and have the mind imputed to it by the Leicester sorcerers, would before now have put all the books ablaze in all parts of the world. Ye Leicester sorcerers, we defy you. Get your so-called Dr. Thomas spirit to move a single book off the shelves of the office at the Athenaeum rooms into the stove, and if his unaided spirit is unequal to it, send a few other kindred spirits to help him, and if they are not able, rouse the whole spirit land to the rescue. Set all your mediums at work, and bring such a flight of ghosts as it shall be enough to blow down the Athenaeum, and scatter Christadelphian works to the four winds. And ye shall give such a testimony to your power as shall make all Birmingham believe, and in a while all England. But mind no tricks. Bring the genuine article only, an army of ghosts, who being able to move furniture will of course find it very easy work to make the books walk down the stairs and processionize towards the Black Country, where there are plenty of blazing fires for their reception. Of course, there will be a crowd in the street to watch the wonderful performance, but this need not interfere. The ghosts have only to carry the books high enough in the air to keep them safe from mundane interference, and to make it quite easy, no ghost should be allowed to carry more than one book under his spiritual arm. The safe transits of the books sky high out of Birmingham will be the making of spiritualism forever. And while the spirits are about it, they need not restrict themselves to books. We are assured by their disciples they can carry men. There could be no impediment, therefore, to the deportation of a Christadelphian or two along with the books. This would make the triumph complete. Now, ye sorcerers, Here's a chance for you. Will you take it? Ye dare not. Ye love darkness rather than light. Ye cower in shaded rooms and perform superstitious ceremonies. And by the magnetic energy of your own bodies and brains, which ye confound with the disembodied intelligences which exist only in your imagination. But when ye gibber inanities, or perform unmeaning feats such as moving tables or elevating instruments in midair, in electrical conclaves of ignorant men, whose heads and nerves unconsciously supply the force employed and generate the ideas evolved, ye but illustrate the folly of our barbarous forefathers, who attributed the workings of nature to gods of their own imagination. Only ye have less excuse, and merit the reprobation of all wise men. Unquote. I would say that Robert Roberts got a little upset here. And once again, I'm not surprised by the name-calling and drama. I am surprised by all the yees. Ye sorcerers is probably the most memorable line here for me. It's just so silly and Victorian. What will he say next? Thou witch, ye shall be banished. Ye old wizard hath brought forth the spirit of Dr. Thomas. It's just funny in the old-time languages. Just makes it funnier to me. And usually I do try to minimize how much of like this rambling aggression I read on the podcast, but there's so much happening in this article. I didn't really just want to pull a quote or two. But the Fantasia imagery of books like dancing out of the Birmingham office and going for a little ghostly dance down the street, only to like chaotically throw themselves in the fire is just spectacular. Like that scene with all the water and the brooms and mops and stuff dancing, but instead it's books and fires. And then just like imagine seeing grown men getting carried out of the building by ghosts and they're like bumping up and down like Mickey Mouse. You know, Walt Disney would have loved animating this whole fever dream that he just recorded. But Roberts did publish this article, and as it turns out, there was a magazine for the spiritualist community, and they read this article and it got them mad. So they replied by publishing their own commentary on this. And this will also shock some people. I do know we have a few active Christadelphians listening who may have not really heard an outside opinion on the Christadelphians, because the spiritualists were not about to allow this disrespect from Roberts towards their community regarding their problems. Like, they could have just written, it's not our fault, so you got a ghost problem. Go call the Ghostbusters, dude. But they didn't. Probably because that classic movie didn't exist yet, but also because they decided they were going to set the record straight. So here's an excerpt from the magazine called The Medium and the Daybreak. It was published November 24th, 1871, under the title The Modern Brethren of Christ. And they do not hold back. They wrote, quote, perhaps the most detestable creed in the civilized world is that held by a pinch of eccentric people who style themselves Christadelphians. Poor Christ! How disgusted he must be by his patronizing would-be brethren. They publish a creed, not one of the conditions of which was recognized by Jesus, not one of which can be substantiated by reason or human experience, and conversely, there are protests in it which go against much that is true. Notwithstanding these eccentricities, we know some excellent Christadelphians who have some peculiar psychological experiences and are too good men and large souls to be confined within the narrow limits of their sectarian fold. What is more surprising in this creed of this clique is the fact that man's duty to man and his recognition of a standard of truth within himself are never once mentioned. On the contrary, human salvation is predicated upon the acceptance of a thread of dogmas, and no liberty whatever is allowed for the soul of man to search for itself. The abominable and immoral procedure bears fruit in the narrow uncharitableness of the sect generally, as also in the egotism, spiritual pride, and pharisaical self-laudation of many of its leading members. An instance of this moral aberration is given in the current number of their monthly magazine. Spiritualism is ruthlessly attacked. It seems that a family in Leicester, with whom we are quite unacquainted, had fallen away from the sect and embraced spiritualism. In their experiment, a spirit communicated purporting to be Dr. Thomas, the great apostle and author of works on Christadelphianism. Like many other men of intellect who have been perverted by earthly notions, he came back to confess his shortcomings and misdirections, and desired that all his work should be burned. Forthwith, the editor of the Christadelphian, overwhelmed with his love to Christ, flies into a towering passion, hotter by far than the fires to which the spiritual Dr. Thomas desired his works to be committed, and makes a violent personal onslaught upon the investigators of truth at Leicester. Surely the editor must be a believer in spiritualism with a vengeance, or the communication from this translated brother sectarian could not influence him in such a positive manner. He does believe in the phenomena. He confesses it thus, elevating instruments in midair under electrical conclaves of ignorant men, whose heads and nerves unconsciously supply the force employed. If the phenomena are facts, then why denounce them? And if they require conditions for their development, namely electrical conclaves of ignorant men, why insultingly dare Dr. Thomas to carry his books out of the holy place in Birmingham, where the editorial luminary presides with such hot zeal, and toss them into the flames so characteristic of the Black Country? We are sorry to see our Christadelphian friends suffer so severely under this acute attack of spiritualism, but if he will only allow the disease to run its course, it will purge his moral system of much intellectual darkness, and he will be able to declare himself of the family of God and man, and relieve the Judean spiritualist of being in any way party to his unkind and unjustifiable denunciations." Unquote. Whew! They seriously clapped back. And to be fair, they did not start this. They hadn't published anything about the Christadelphians and their ghost problem. Meanwhile, as we saw, the Christadelphians had been publishing all these accusations, false information, and spreading information about frauds and smearing their community's name for quite a while. This time, they finally stood up for themselves and were pretty tired of Robert's attitude, because he had clearly flown into a rage over the story of Dr. Thomas possibly being a ghost. It's interesting to me that the spiritualists pointed out a few things that have even come up in this podcast, like the focus on individual salvation and a lack of charity towards others. But they also noticed what I pointed out earlier in the Christadelphians. They've actually admitted to believing in some aspects of spiritualism, even if they tried to find another explanation for it. Most people outside of the Christadelphians, like Houdini, tried to discredit spiritualism by saying everything they witnessed was fraud. Like, wires pulling the trumpet in midair, people were dressed as ghosts in the cabinet, people were in another room knocking on the walls, that sort of thing. That's all saying that there was premeditated deceit. And I think for people with no extrasensory abilities but a keen mind, that made sense as the best option to get income by hosting a seance. I even read a book by a famous paranormal investigator, and she mentioned that real encounters with the paranormal happened and were recorded on the show. But because it was a TV show, there was always the incentive to make something happen, even if nothing was really happening. So even today, the pressure to make money interferes with the integrity of people's actions in that setting. But it is unusual that everyone else almost always attacked these showy parts of the seances. But the Christadelphians were apparently accepting of all of these performances, but they just kept insisting that the power that caused it was not ghosts. It could be some other mystical, invisible thing like telepathy, but never ghosts. So they actually were pretty open to, the idea of these things happening at seances. And as we read too, historically, they've been quite impressed by them. So that's why even these spiritualists were almost confused. They're like, you believe we have the ability to move objects with our minds, but you don't think we can talk to a ghost? You're kind of closer to accepting spiritualism than other people. And I recorded one more exchange between these two groups when Roberts gave another rebuttal in the January 1872 edition of the Christadelphian magazine under the title, "The Spiritualists and Dr. Thomas's Ghost." So this is the last part of the saga for you. Quote, "The rulers of the spiritualist, not spirit, world could not very well pass by our challenge about the books, so editorial notice is taken of the matter in the spiritualistic organ, entitled The Medium, which is appropriate enough, and Daybreak, which is inappropriate enough. For spiritualism, instead of being the break of day, is one of the deepening shades of night, destined shortly to disappear before the true rising of the sun, Jesus Christ at his coming. But the editorial notice of this matter does not come square on the matter, but crookedly and very partially. The editor apparently failed to be as pleasantly exercised by some of our remarks about Dr. Thomas's ghost being at Leicester. He did not like our familiarity. Probably still he disliked our logic. At all events, he wanted very much to reply, and attempted it, letting hard words fly, raising a dust, and making an exit into the cloud. The editor felt that he wrote without a doubt from his point of view. We are of all men the most to be detested by spiritualists. No system is so unfriendly to spiritualism as the truth. The truth is the mortal foe of spiritualism. There can be no compromise or quarter in the war between them. The truth gives spiritualism no leverage at all. It meets its opening falsehood with a direct negative. It says the dead know not anything. There is no wisdom in the grave. It does not give spiritualism the smallest chance. He says we flew into a towering passion. This shows how deeply the arrows of our logic have pierced. There was no passion about it. He endorses the view that Dr. Thomas was really at the Leicester table leg. He says, like many other men of intellect who have been perverted by earthly notions, he came back to confess his shortcomings and misdirections, and desired all his works should be burned. If your ghosts are realities and not the shadows of your own imagination, set them to work at the missionary enterprise of burning Dr. Thomas's books. They have the desire according to you. They have the power according to you. If they lack conditions, there are no end of embodied friends to supply them. Here's the point. Come right on to it, Mr. Editor, and not dodge. Destroy the books or be convicted of nursing an imposture. But again, we say no trick, the genuine article only. None but ghosts need apply. Any other creature will run the risk of an earthly custodianship and unpleasant quarters. Instead of fairly meeting this, which is the point, the editor tries to make us out believers in a way that calls for a stronger adjective than we should care to use. What belief is expressed? It is not that the so-called spirit manifestations are no spirit manifestations at all, but the working of natural force supplied by the animal organisms in the room. Is this believing in the phenomena? If so, scientific men believe, which spiritualists know well they do not. Scientific men believe that a table moves when subjected to a vitomagnetic current effluent from the fingertips or otherwise of the operators, just as the needle deflects under the living gaze, but they scorn the notion of dead man's ghosts having anything to do with it. Remember the books and the flames. Have pity on Dr. Thomas's ghost. Unquote. So that's the end of our Christadelphian ghost story. And this whole exchange is so funny to me. I mean, first off, these ex-Christadelphians got the Christadelphian magazine to publish an entire article on John Thomas's ghost after he died. If there really was a ghost, then this is some of the most legendary irony that I have ever heard, because Thomas railed against the existence of ghosts out his life. If there wasn't a ghost, then it's just funny that their claim led to this ridiculous article. I'd almost wonder if they just wanted to provoke Roberts, honestly, because I think everyone could have predicted that Roberts would lose it over this. From what I've read, Roberts was the one who initiated this written part of the drama. So he upped the ante from people just talking about a seance that Dr. Thomas showed up to railing against it in writing, which is now available to read over 100 years later. So thanks to all those ex-Christadelphians all those years ago, because otherwise we wouldn't get to read about this ghost story drama. I also personally grew up thinking that Christadelphians were very serious, studious, and honestly, too boring to have really done anything too sinister or ridiculous. My ecclesia didn't have much scandal, and I probably assumed that ecclesias had always been like the one I attended. But looking at their history, there are so many outlandish moments like this, and we've also seen in other episodes that their history can also be darker than someone in a modern Christadelphian setting may realize. But I'm so glad I found their spooky history, because I absolutely did not have ex-Christadelphians having a seance with Dr. Thomas's ghost on my bingo card either. Also, even though I personally believe in ghosts, I don't think Thomas's ghost would have asked to have his own books burned. If anything, I think he'd sneak it on your nightstand when you're not around, because he just seems vain and egotistical from what's recorded about him. I also think that the Thomas I've read about had such a big ego that I don't think even death would have humbled him enough to want to destroy his life's works so that others could be free of his restrictive, uncharitable doctrines. Like, the titles of his books were even chiseled on his gravestone at Greenwood Cemetery, and he had unfinished manuscripts on his desk when he died. He was proud to be a writer, and people knew it. I also know that he was a strong-willed guy, and I do think that if he wanted them burned, he probably would have done so if ghosts can do that. Maybe it was cathartic for this family at Leicester to burn their copy of Elpis Israel, but I would be surprised if that sentiment originated with Dr. John Thomas and his ghost. It is, however, very funny, and the rumor that John Thomas's ghost basically wanting to burn it all down is just so amazing. I would almost be tempted to burn a copy of Elpis Israel after I die just to mess with Christadelphians at this point. Like, if I die and you just see a charred copy of Elpis Israel or like Eureka shortly afterwards, it wasn't John Thomas's ghost, it was me. Because I would have to see if it could be done, and it's just kind of funny, and they'd be like, was it his ghost after all? The other thing that I wanted to mention is that this is just another example of Christadelphians leaving the group for spiritualism, which is clearly something that kept happening throughout their history. John Thomas records someone he was associated with converting to spiritualism in his biography, and that seemed random to me at first, but then all these Christadelphian editors kept bringing up spiritualism in their magazines year after year after year, which makes me think that there's almost like a pipeline from Christadelphianism to spiritualism that has gone on with not a lot of people, but with a steady, like, small stream of people leaving for spiritualism. Even more funny is that, in a beautiful coincidence, I left the Christadelphians, and now I occasionally attend a spiritualist church because I've found that that's the belief system that most closely aligns with my current beliefs now. And this dance between these two groups has been happening for generations, and it's still going on to the present day. And it's truly a 180-degree flip to go from one religion to the other, to go from this patriarchal system to a feminist system, from the idea of nothingness and death to this other sort of paradise right after death, from these conditional rewards for a select few to an open door for everyone. And I wish there were other recorded stories of Christadelphians leaving the group for spiritualists, because I'd be so curious to know, like, what came first. Did they get tired of the strict doctrine, or did they witness something unexplainable and have to open up to the idea of ghosts and spirits? I truly don't know, but I would really love to find out. So to start to wind things down, I know many ex-Christadelphians go down different paths after leaving the Christadelphians. As we've seen in this podcast, many people go towards atheism, but I'm also aware of some who have gravitated towards other religions, and there are those like me who've gone more towards spirituality. There's no one right option, but when looking back on what we've learned in this episode, I think there's a few takeaways to think about. One surprising one for me was how quickly the Christadelphians tried to disprove the Bible when it didn't align with their views in the examples we looked at today. That's definitely a red flag for me that control is involved, rather than the group truly wanting to learn the truth of the Bible. If you claim that the truth is in the Bible, then why are you changing what the Bible says? That should set off major alarm bells for anyone who attends a church that relies on the Bible, not just Christadelphians, and sees that behavior. It seems apparent that if they are telling you to believe something that is not sufficiently proved by what is recorded in the Bible, which you're using as evidence, then it seems like the motivation is likely loyalty to the beliefs of the group, and that must be more important to the faithfulness to what God supposedly recorded for humans in the Bible. I also just want to point out that it's not in someone's best interest to have someone tell them they have to believe something, and most churches don't require the level of conformity that makes that control of others acceptable behavior. Many churches don't have strict dress codes. They don't have strict views of appropriate music or strict attendance requirements like many of us have seen with the Christadelphians. I am not even kidding when I say that I went to a spiritualist church and they sang The Circle of Life from Lion King at a church service. My friend nearly fell over crying and laughing. I've also sat behind someone at the spiritualist church wearing shorts and a short sleeve shirt with Disney characters on it during the service. And first, clearly that environment is much better for a goofy person like me, but I really want to point out that all of the things that we are conditioned to believe are normal are only normal within that Christadelphian culture. It's not everyone. And most of the rules that we follow or followed for those of us who have left were really just traditions. They're not actually based on the Bible. Like, did Moses say, oh, you can only use the black Christadelphian hymn book to sing to God? Did Jesus say that you need to wear a full suit and tie on Sundays? Did Elijah say that women's skirts should always go past their knees? No, all of these little things are just part of control. They take away people's choices and autonomy, such as how they dress. So it becomes a part of coercive control. And it's really freeing for me to attend a spiritualist church where no one cared what anyone wore. There was no hymn book. There were no rules about music needing to be old fashioned. No one took attendance. No one knew my name. Because in the ecclesia that I attended, there was literally a guy with an attendance book who would mark down every time you were at meeting, whether you made it to Sunday school or not. Every time you missed a service, it was recorded. Attendance was mandatory. And I've even heard that some ecclesias would kick you out if you missed services too often. Now, that isn't normal for people to be tracked like that, I don't think. Now that it's not normal for me to be tracked like that, it feels really creepy. So if someone is using the Bible to say you need to do something and they're taking away your autonomy and they're kind of twisting the words in the Bible to say, oh, it doesn't say that. It says this. It says what we think it says. That seems to indicate a controlling environment. And you may want to consider what people have to gain by controlling you and whether you're okay with that. Secondly, and on a much happier note, this has taught me that there are super cool ways to just deconstruct from Christadelphian views. If we go all the way back to the beginning of this episode, we remember that believing in ghosts is incompatible with believing the Christadelphian belief system, right? So if you've left or are leaving, why not attend a seance? Go on a ghost tour, sleep in a haunted hotel. Because if you experience something spooky like I did, then apparently you're off the hook for all of their beliefs. They said so themselves, that their system of beliefs would be exploded if ghosts are real. I have dozens of people who have corroborated the evidence of the ghosts that I lived with. So I'm off the hook for believing Christadelphian teachings forever without even having to attack a single one of their beliefs. They believe all of their views are true and correct, including that there is no consciousness after death. For me personally, I witnessed enough evidence that I believe that there is. And if there is, then according to them, all of their beliefs aren't true. So why not go on a paranormal investigation or visit a spiritualist church or book a reading with a reputable medium? That would be way more interesting and easy for deconstructing than trying to reinterpret the entire Bible by yourself. And this is the most surprising method of deconstructing I've, come across, but it's also potentially the most fun. So I hope that you enjoyed this episode on spiritualism. I've enjoyed researching stories of ghosts, mediums, hypnotists, and spiritualists in the historical Christadelphian literature and being a little bit silly while applying critical thinking to their arguments to get some insight on their culture for those of us who are now outside of it. As always, you should believe whatever you want to believe, and I don't expect anyone to become a spiritualist after listening to this, but I hope that you learned something about Christadelphian history that you may not have known before, and I'm glad that my personal experiences have allowed me to have some unique insight into the topic of today's episode. It turns out I'm one of many former Christadelphians to leave the group and get spooky. So thanks again for listening to this episode, and I hope you tune into the next episode of the Life After Leaving podcast. Thank you to everyone who has helped make this episode of the podcast possible. Today's episode was edited by me, Zinnia. I'd also like to thank Al Kroons for creating our intro music and the ex-Christadelphians that submitted audio for the intro music. If you'd like to join our community, you can find us at the group for ex-Christadelphians on Facebook. You can also follow our social media on Facebook and Instagram at Life After Leaving Podcast. If you'd like to come on the podcast, reach out to me at lifeafterleavingpodcast@gmail.com. And if you're enjoying this podcast, please consider leaving a rating and review or sharing this podcast with a friend. That's all for today. Thanks and see you next time.